Chapter 3700. The 3-minute shooting time was almost up. The referee, who was about to have a heart attack, swallowed hard. He still remembered the password. When the shooting time was up, the Chinese female student he had been staring at calmly put away her gun. She had no idea what kind of visual impact her shooting had made on others. The shooting competition was over. The referee looked at the Chinese female student, who turned around and walked back to the line. She seemed to look at him, but also seemed to not look at him. She walked away with the other students with steady step. "I think I need to rest for a while and catch my breath." The referee clutched his chest and breathed heavily. He really did look like he was having a heart attack. The young soldier did not stare at Yi Qian like the referee, so he did not suffer any impact. Seeing that the referee's expression was not right, he immediately went to support him. The sun was a little hot today. It was as if summer was coming early. It was so hot that sweat kept coming out. Monfei did not say that the referee had a heatstroke. The soldier just thought that the referee had been too tired these past few days and was sick. Yi Qian returned to the line. Zhang Minghong and the other 12 students saw the gentle smile on her face. They all smiled at the same time. Yi Qian's performance in the competition just now must have been very outstanding. After the rifle and pistol shooting competition, it was time for the car shooting competition. Then it was time for the rescue through the minefield. Although each competition was short, the technical content of each competition was the same. The physical and mental exhaustion was very high. The senior generals of Monfei received the referee's report. After a short moment of surprise, they chose to shake their heads and laugh. "That's impossible. I've never met someone like that. According to what you said, her shooting speed is better than a special forces soldier. She's just a military school student. There's no way she can compare to a special forces soldier." Of course, we have to admit that this Chinese female student is very good. Her comprehensive ability made Colonel Fellet from West Point exclaim. "We all know that she's really good, but no matter how good she is, she can't be better than a special forces soldier." Well, how should we put it? We can only say that she's better than many military school students. Maybe she can really become a special forces soldier in the future. But who knows? Although the Monfei military was shocked by Yi Qian's performance, it was not enough to make them feel afraid. What they were really afraid of was the soldiers behind the Chinese students. To be able to nurture such a powerful cadet, there must be a very powerful army behind him. This was the focus of their attention. As for Yi Qian, that was not the main point. This was also why Yi Qian dared to show off his unique skills in front of the judges. They would not pay special attention to him because of his personal achievements. What they cared about was the country and the military he was loyal to. It was worth mentioning that the Japanese students did not want to meet the Chinese students, but they also wanted to surpass the Chinese students. In the minefield, the Japanese students became neighbors with the Chinese students. When the Japanese students saw this, their faces changed on the spot. It wasn't fear, but the solemnity of a battle with the enemy. Yi Qian, who had wanted to laugh, restrained his smile so as not to scare the other party. The rescue in the minefield referred to the rescue of the driver who drove the Hummer into a minefield and was trapped. The driver was played by a Monfei soldier, and the students from various countries entered the minefield to rescue the driver. The students had to be very careful when they entered the minefield because it was a minefield. If they made a wrong judgment, they would be directly judged to be killed. Chapter 3701. The Chinese students had never trained for a competition like this before. It wasn't just the Chinese students who had not trained for it, there were also students from other countries who had not trained for it. It was the same for Yi Qian's team. After spreading out the landform map of the minefield, the 18 students sat together and began to make a detailed plan. "I know how to drive, but I don't know if the Hummer in the minefield is good or bad. After we get there, we'll first rescue the wounded, check on their injuries, bandage them, and treat them. If the Hummer is good, We'll put the wounded in the car and I'll drive them out. The problem now is that we need to know where the minefield is and where the non-minefield is. Yi Qian, who was holding a pencil in his hand, slowly traced the landform map. His brows furrowed slightly, and he looked up to ask Zhang Minghong, "What's your plan?" Zhang Minghong, who had been staring at the map, frowned. When he heard this, he looked up at Yi Qian and said hesitantly, "This is my judgment. Look, this is the entrance. The trapped Hummer and the driver are in this position. Can we judge that the Hummer drove through a non-minefield? That makes sense. If the Hummer drove through a non-minefield, we can totally follow the Hummer's path. This is a route that can quickly enter the minefield, but I keep feeling that something is wrong." As the students discussed in low voices, Zhang Minghong spoke again. "Yes, I also feel that something is wrong. Since this is a minefield rescue, the inspection team would not leave such a loophole for us. Just now I've been suspecting that the path the Hummer drove through might be a minefield. Leaving such a big loophole for us is purely to bait us. Yi Qian, do you think this is possible?" Yi Qian, who was asked, laughed. "Yes, it's very possible. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a minefield rescue. Looking at the landform of the entire minefield, I think this route can be." Zhang Minghong saw that Yi Qian supported his idea, and his furrowed brows relaxed. He used the pencil in his hand to draw a line on the map. "Go in from here, go around here." As Zhang Minghong's pencil slowly drew across the paper, the team members discussed it, and Yi Qian carefully deployed the plan. A clear rescue route was drawn out. During the competition, some foreign soldiers chose to follow the Hummer's driving path into the minefield. As a result, as soon as they entered the minefield, they were judged to have struck a mine and died. The Chinese students couldn't help but rub their foreheads. That was indeed the case. Even though they had made very detailed arrangements, 3 of the Chinese students still died because of a misjudgment when they entered the minefield. Facing the dead students, they still had to continue entering. This time, they were even more cautious. Even Yi Qian was on tenterhooks, just in case. Fortunately, the Chinese students did not encounter any problems in the end. They successfully rescued the driver of the Hummer, checked his injuries, bandaged his wounds, and then went to Yi Qian to restart the Hummer and drive it out of the minefield according to the track they had just entered. When they came out, everyone's backs were drenched in sweat. At this time, it was already close to dusk, and the victory flag was already planted in the competition venue. In front of them, there were already a few flags of other countries fluttering in the wind. It's still too late. We're already in 6th place. Tianqin counted the flags of other countries fluttering outside the minefield in front of them and felt a little regretful. When she saw that Japan had only just driven their Hummer out, and the Chinese team was already in 1st place in Asia, she couldn't help but feel happy. At this time, the Chinese students had not realized that something big was about to happen. Chapter 3702. After Tianqin finished laughing happily, she looked up at the bright red national flag fluttering in the wind. She stared at it for a long time, her eyes full of respect. Yi Qian also looked up, her eyes filled with the same respect. She stared deeply at the national flag. She thought about how they had raised the national flag together in a foreign country, so that the returning foreign soldiers could see it. Just thinking about it made her heart surge with emotion. The 5-starred red flag fluttering in the wind, the victory song so loud. Yi Qian, who was singing deep in his heart, replied to Tianqin, "I've never had a training like this before. It's not easy to get 6th place. Before this, I was prepared for the worst. My ranking in this competition might fall out of the top 10. Now that I'm 6th place and 1st place in Asia, I'm quite happy." Tianqin's sweet voice rang out, "Yes, I'm quite happy now too. Let's go and gather." The 2 girls looked at each other and smiled. They looked up together again and stared deeply at the fluttering national flag before trotting over to gather. The returning Japanese students had already seen the Chinese national flag fluttering in the wind. They clenched their hands so tightly that their nails dug into their palms. The male student driving the Hummer stared at the bright red national flag fluttering in the sunset with a cold look in his eyes. He really wanted to tear down the national flag that was so glaring to his eyes. The national flag was placed on the field, which meant that the Chinese students had already taken down the minefield. The Chinese students had once again finished the competition ahead of them, beating them again and again, making their national flag line up behind the red national flag of the Chinese side again and again. How great would it be if they didn't have this red flag? How great would that be? The Japanese student driving the military Hummer held the steering wheel tightly with both hands and maintained a uniform speed as he drove out of the minefield. Boom, something was hit. Yi Qian, who was walking to the front of the gathering, heard the sound of something being knocked down behind him. His eyelids twitched violently, and then he saw a scene that made his expression change drastically. When the Japanese driver reversed the Hummer, he suddenly knocked down the Chinese flagpole. With a crack, the flagpole fell down, and the national flag hanging on the flagpole also fell down. Yi Qian, who had discovered this, reacted quickly. He ran back and shouted at the same time, "Stop reversing! Stop reversing!" Tianqin did not react at first. She only turned her head when Yi Qian suddenly turned around and ran back. She happened to see the Hummer driven by the student from Japan knock down the flag of their country. It was as if the Hummer did not notice and continued to reverse. Fuck! Regardless of whether it was intentional or not, Tianqin, who was a soldier, cursed in a low voice when she saw her country's flag being knocked down and crushed by the wheels. She then turned around and ran back. Tianqin had barely taken 2 steps when she felt a gust of wind blowing past her. She saw Instructor Li, who had always been cold and calm, running forward like a gust of wind. Li Jinyan was standing in front of the students who had just returned from the competition, and his eyes were fixed on the fluttering national flag. From the moment the Hummer reversed to the moment it hit the national flag, he saw it clearly. When the Hummer reversed, he noticed it. When the Hummer continued to reverse, he was already running. At the same time, he whispered to the Japanese instructor who was standing still, "You'd better pray that your students don't do anything stupid." As soon as he finished speaking, the Hummer crashed into the national flag, and then the Hummer continued to reverse. Chapter 3703. The national flag was the symbol of a country and the embodiment of a country's dignity. To the Chinese soldiers, the national flag was the life of the Chinese soldiers. As long as they were alive, the national flag would not fall. Now, seeing their country's national flag being knocked down and about to be crushed by the wheels, all of the Chinese students were enraged. Yi Qian, who was the closest and had the fastest reaction, locked her gaze on the red flag on the ground. At this moment, she only had one thought in her mind. She wanted to pick up the fallen national flag. She wanted this bright red national flag to fly high once again. Those who humiliate our country must return the humiliation. The military Hummer knocked down the flagpole, and the flag that was fluttering in the wind fell. The car was still reversing. The Manchurian soldiers had already noticed and whistled sharply, reminding the Japanese students to stop reversing. However, it was useless. It was as if the other party did not notice at all, and the car was still slowly reversing. The Japanese driver knew what he was doing and was able to keep his cool. Maki Fujino, who was sitting in the front passenger seat, said softly, "Fukumoto, we have already knocked down the flag. Maintain your current speed and reverse slowly. There is no need to rush. We cannot let the assessment team suspect us. Maintain your current speed and reverse slowly. Very good, continue to reverse." Maki Fujino was the leader of the Japanese students. His father was a well-known right-wing figure in their country. His hatred for the Chinese was not ordinary. When he heard that Lina Fujino wanted to knock down the dazzling red flag, Maki Fujino only thought for 3 seconds before nodding his head in agreement. In those 3 seconds, he was not considering whether to do it or not. Instead, he was considering how to do it. In a short period of time, he thought of a way. He thought of a way to escape responsibility. That was to pretend that they did not notice that they had knocked down the flagpole and continue reversing at the same speed. The process of knocking down the flagpole and reversing would definitely be stopped by someone. They could continue to pretend that they did not notice and maintain the same speed. Why did they have to maintain the same speed? The reason was simple. If they had done it deliberately, then according to common sense, when they were discovered, they should have immediately accelerated to achieve their goal. It was because they did not notice and did not know that they had knocked down the Chinese national flag that they had maintained the same speed. At that time, even if the Chinese side was very angry, as long as they insisted that they didn't do it on purpose and that they really didn't find out, the Chinese side could do nothing to them. In the end, they could only swallow this anger. After he explained the plan, he said to Fukumoto Rina, "The Chinese students are very cunning, they will see through our flaws. At that time, we are likely to be like the Korean students, all our scores will be cancelled to 0, and we will be disqualified from the competition. We must make it so that no matter how angry the Chinese are, they can't do anything about it. They can't do anything to us like they did to the Korean students. Later, as long as we don't admit that we did it on purpose and apologize to the Chinese students, and let the assessment team and the foreign military instructors see our apologetic attitude, then we can completely ignore the Chinese students. We have already apologized. If the Chinese students still have any objections, the public opinion will definitely be directed towards us. At that time, even if the Chinese side achieves good results, what's the use?" Chapter 3704. Fukumoto Rina, who was still thinking about how to get out of this situation, had a cold gleam in her eyes when she heard Fukumoto Maki's words. She finally understood Fukumoto Maki's real intention. She held the steering wheel tightly with both hands and said excitedly, "Previously, there were already Korean students who were disqualified because of the Chinese students. Today, we appeared again and apologized for our unintentional actions. However, the Chinese students did not accept it. When the time comes, all the participating students and instructors will think that the Chinese students do not have a tolerant heart. I think the Chinese students will feel even worse when that happens. It was obvious that we deliberately knocked down their flag, but everyone blamed them. Fukumoto Maki, don't you think this will make their country look bad again? Fukumoto-kun is indeed the most outstanding heir of the Fukumoto family. That's right, there's nothing happier than seeing their country look bad because of them." Fukumoto Maki smiled politely. This was Japan's Maki Fujino's plan. It could be said that it was many times more brilliant than Korea's plan, which was so direct that it was obvious that they were deliberately provoking China. With such a plan, Fukumoto Rina continued to reverse at the same speed even when she heard the sharp whistles of the Monfei soldiers. Soon, the red flag on the ground was covered by the huge military Hummer. Next, they only needed to turn the steering wheel, and the front wheels would directly roll over the flag, leaving a black wheel print on the flag that the Chinese soldiers were proud of. The wheel print was not just a wheel print. It was a humiliation to the Chinese students by the Japanese students, trampling on the Chinese people's dignity. After returning to China, they could even use it as a joke, telling the Chinese students how they humiliated the Chinese people in front of the Chinese soldiers, making the Chinese soldiers unable to do anything to them, and could only endure their humiliation. If they really succeeded today, then it would show that the Chinese soldiers were very, very incompetent. If she really let them get away with their evil plan today, she wouldn't be Yi Jian anymore. Yi Qian had already raised his running speed to the limit. He was so fast that his figure became a series of afterimages. He was so fast that Li Jinyan, who was running behind him, shouted in his heart, "Qing Miao, I'm counting on you today. I'm counting on you." The lives of Chinese soldiers, the faith of Chinese soldiers, and the dignity of a nation all depend on you today. Her speed was so fast that the air and wind formed an invisible barrier that slammed into Yi Qian's face. Her cheeks were crushed and deformed. Her clear eyes, which reflected the setting sun, seemed to have a raging fire burning in them. She stared resolutely ahead, until Li Jinyan, who was only 10 meters away, saw the scene in front of him. His eyes almost popped out of their sockets. He had already run to his limit, and at this moment, he was so violent that the veins on his neck bulged. It seemed that if he exerted a little more force, his veins would burst. Yi Qian? The hoarse roars of the Chinese students came from behind, like a sudden clap of thunder in the entire arena, startling all the students who had just finished their matches. They all looked over at the Chinese students. What happened this time? Tianqin, who was running, was so shocked by the scene before her that her knees went soft. She stumbled and lost her balance, and finally fell to the ground. Li Jinyan was already behind her. Seeing this, he wanted to stop and help Tianqin up. Tianqin shouted, "Instructor Li, go and check on Yi Qian. Hurry!" Chapter 3705. She saw Yi Qian rush to the back of the military Hummer, and then grab the tailgate with both hands, and dive under the wheels in a suicidal manner. Yi Qian knew that it was impossible to stop the Japanese students, so she deliberately avoided them as she ran, so that the 2 Japanese students wouldn't be able to see her through the rearview mirror. She was worried that once she was discovered by the 2 of them, they would immediately speed up in order to achieve their goal. She wouldn't even have a chance to rescue her. Therefore, she had been avoiding the 2 of them so that they could see her in the rearview mirror. That was why she made such a move. Yi Qian fearlessly dived under the car in a suicidal manner. Just as the front wheels were about to crush the national flag, she grabbed the bottom of the car with one hand, and the other hand grabbed the corner of the flag. She then pulled it into her arms and hugged the flag that was about to be crushed by the wheels. The chassis of the military Hummer was very tall, and could fit a person under the wheels. Yi Qian's frame was slender, and she was extremely agile. Coupled with the fact that the car wasn't going too fast, all these factors combined allowed Yi Qian to successfully hold the flag in her arms. However, the 5 fingers that grabbed the flag still scratched the ground fiercely, especially her middle finger. Half of her fingernail was flipped open, and her blood stained the flag that she had sworn to protect with her life. At this moment, she had completed her mission as a soldier. She had used her life to protect the dignity of her country. Yi Qian hugged the flag tightly with one hand, and the bottom of the car with the other. She gently closed her eyes and heaved a long sigh of relief. This time, she didn't disgrace her mission, and she didn't let her country down. The Monfei soldiers jogging from the front didn't realize that Yi Qian had dived under the car's chassis, but the Japanese students and their instructor, Hirano Ridge, did. Fujino-kun, Fukumoto-kun. The Japanese students who witnessed everything were furious. They could still explain that it wasn't intentional when they knocked down the Chinese flag, but if a Chinese student was killed by a military Hummer driven by their own students, then no matter how they explained it, it could be considered as murder. Just like the female student from Korea. Inside the car, Maki Fujino and Rina Fukumoto didn't know that something big had happened. They only knew that the wheels had to run over the flag that they hated the most. They had succeeded. They trampled on the faith of the Chinese soldiers and ruthlessly humiliated the dignity of the Chinese nation. They did it. Now, it's time for us to explain ourselves, Maki Fujino said with a smile. Let's see how the Chinese students will accept our apology. She sneered. They can only accept our apology. Get off the car. After the car stopped, the 2 of them adjusted their expressions and jumped out of the car, pretending that they didn't know what had happened. The students from Japan all ran over. Those who didn't see it now knew what had happened. They were all shocked and even panicked. The expressions of the students from their own country made the 2 planners' hearts skip a beat. There was something not quite right. The students from their country should not have such expressions. Although they didn't tell them the plan, Everyone didn't want to see the Chinese flag rise again and again. Even if they were surprised by what the two of them did, they shouldn't have such a shocked, panicked, and scared expression. There seems to be a problem, Fukumoto Lena softly said, but her expression was very relaxed, not showing the slightest bit of guilt. Chapter 3706. Maki Fujino could also tell that something was wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on it. Why would they be afraid? He could understand shock and worry, but fear was the only thing he couldn't understand. Also, none of them looked surprised. Something was even more wrong. When the car came to a stop, Yi Qian let go of the flag and lay on the ground, panting heavily. It was her first time doing something so suicidal. It was even more thrilling than going to the battlefield. She had done it all in one go. If she had to choose again, she would still do it. Yi Qian closed her eyes and panted heavily. She hugged the flag tightly and took a deep breath. She moved her legs and her back rubbed against the uneven ground. She wriggled her way out of the car. The flag remained in her arms and didn't touch the ground a second time. Dignity that she used her life to protect should be treated with dignity. A pair of slender hands reached over. A cold voice seemed to come from a deep abyss. "Give me your hand," Li Jinyan, who was kneeling on the ground, reached out his hand. His gaze was fixed on Yi Qian, who was crawling out from under the car. His cold eyes were sharp. "Are you hurt?" This was the second sentence. Yi Jian turned her head with some difficulty and glanced outside. The corners of her mouth were already slowly curling up into a smile. "You're not injured, hiss." Before she could finish her sentence, she sucked in a breath of cold air. She wanted to hand the flag to Li Jinyan, but unexpectedly, she touched the fingernail of her middle finger. She felt a sudden pain and couldn't help but suck in a breath of cold air. The 10 fingers were connected to the heart. How could it not hurt? Li Jinyan's expression suddenly changed. His cold voice was tinged with hostility. "Where are you hurt?" "My finger is hurt. I didn't see it. I'll come out first." "Brother, move aside. You're blocking my way out." Yi Qian could still smile. It was a relaxed smile, but there was no smile in his eyes. Both siblings had the same hostility in their eyes. When she comes out, it's time to settle the score. Li Jinyan, who had stepped aside, did not stand up. Instead, he quietly waited for Yi Qian to climb out from under the car. Then, he used one hand to support Yi Qian's shoulder, and the two of them stood up together. When the Monfei soldier saw this, his expression changed. He stopped and immediately used his walkie-talkie to contact his superiors. How to deal with this matter was beyond his ability. In order to protect their national flag, the Chinese students hid under the moving cars, but the Japanese students didn't notice? Did they really not notice? Like pretending not to hear his warning, pretending not to notice? If that was the case, then this was another murder. He had to contact the higher-ups immediately. Maki Fujino and Rina Fukumoto already knew why their own country's students weren't surprised. They were only shocked and scared. When they turned their heads, they saw Yi Qian standing up from under the car. Their pupils instantly contracted. Just now, a local student had told them that the Chinese student Yi Qian had crawled under the Hummer they were driving. Was she hurt? Did the wheels run over her? Where was the Chinese national flag that they knocked over? Yi Qian, who was standing straight, also saw the two of them. Her dark eyes were filled with coldness. Her gaze was like a cold arrow, and a murderous aura came straight at them. Rina Fukumoto originally wanted to see if Yi Jian had gotten the national flag. Being shot by Yi Jian's cold gaze, her heart suddenly panicked a few times. In a panic, she hurriedly swept her gaze away, and the expression on her face almost couldn't be maintained. Maki Fujino, who had already lowered his head, furrowed his brows. His mind was spinning. The Chinese student had crawled under their car, and messed up their plans. Chapter 3707. Maki Fujino already had a premonition of what would happen next. The members of the arbitration committee and the assessment team would definitely be enraged by this incident. Then, the Japanese students would be in big trouble. Of all their calculations, they did not expect that the Chinese student would actually throw away her life to snatch her country's flag from under the wheels. Her fearless spirit would definitely be admired by the other country's students. No, what he wanted was for the Chinese students to be suppressed by public opinion and humiliate their own country, not for them to be admired by the other country's students. This was the situation he did not want to see the most. He had to think of a way to turn this unfavorable situation around. The Chinese students had already arrived. They glared fiercely at Maki Fujino and Rina Fukumoto, then surrounded Yi Qian. Tianqin was a girl. She held Yi Qian's arms tightly with both hands and asked in panic, "Are you hurt? Let me see if you're hurt. Are you hurt? Are you crushed? Where does it hurt? Let me see," she asked repeatedly, her hands trembling as she touched Yi Jian's body. Yi Jian, who was still holding the national flag in her arms, smiled at her comrades who were worried about her. "I'm fine. Our national flag is fine too. It's very clean. There's no stain on it." Yi Qian shook the flag lightly and handed a corner to Li Jinyan. The two of them pulled the flag flat. It was very clean. Not even a blade of grass was stained. Yi Qian, who was full of respect, stared deeply at the bright red flag that gathered countless loyal souls. The corners of his mouth curled up. When the Chinese students saw this, their eyes were filled with tears. Tianqin's hands gently caressed the flag. Then, she gently and solemnly held up the flag. She lowered her head and planted a deep kiss on the flag that they loved so much. It was really clean. It was so good, so good. Go to the front and bring the flagpole over. Li Jinyan looked up and said to the male students, "There's one in front. Bring it over. The flagpole of Japan is right in front of us." "Okay." Zhang Minghong nodded heavily and strode forward. Several male students immediately followed closely behind. When the Japanese students saw the Chinese students suddenly coming towards them, they instantly made a defensive move. Their eyes followed the movements of the Chinese students, and their bodies became more and more tense. The Chinese students were walking towards them. What did they want? Do you want a fight? Do you want to cause trouble for Fujino and Fukumoto? Fujino and Fukumoto were doing this for the sake of their students. Zhang Minghong and the other 5 boys walked past the Japanese students and picked up the flagpole that had not been put up yet. Zhang Minghong and the other 5 boys walked past the Japanese students and picked up the flagpole that had not been put up yet. "What are you trying to do? Put down our flagpole." When the flagpole was picked up, the Japanese students began to question him. Several male students rushed over and tried to snatch the flagpole back. As soon as they took a step, whistles were blown urgently. The Manfei soldiers, who had just spoken a few words with the Chinese students, were alerted by the Chinese students. They whistled and hurried over. "You broke the flagpole of the Chinese students. Now, you should give your flagpole to the Chinese students. This is your responsibility." The Manfei soldiers shouted as they ran. "You must be responsible for your actions." No, they couldn't. If the Chinese students took away their flagpole, then their sun flag would not be able to be raised. Chapter 3708. When the Japanese students heard that even the Manfei soldiers were on the side of the Chinese students, they looked as if they had been treated unfairly. Maki Fujino stood up. As the leader, he had to stand up at this moment. He stood up and walked towards the Chinese students. To be precise, he was walking towards the Chinese instructor, Li Jinyan. Maki Fujino clenched his fists as he walked over. He looked as if he was angry because the Chinese students wanted to take away their flagpole. However, that was not the case at all. He was indeed very angry. He was angry because he did not manage to crush the Chinese flag. His plan had failed. At the most crucial moment, the Chinese students snatched the flag back. He had never expected that the Chinese students would risk their lives to crawl under the wheels of the moving Hummer and snatch the flag back. He had underestimated the courage of the Chinese students and caused his plan to fail. If he had a second choice, he would not have done it conservatively. Instead, he would have pretended to be shocked when the flag was knocked down. He wanted to brake but accidentally stepped on the accelerator. If that was the case, no matter how brave the Chinese students were, they would not be able to crawl under the wheels to snatch the flag back. Also, when did the Chinese female student crawl under the vehicle? Why did he and Fukumoto not see it? Maki Fujino, who was angry because his plan had failed, stood in front of Li Jinyan. His face was gloomy as if he was trying to maintain his etiquette. He said in a deep voice, "Instructor, why did the Chinese students insist on taking away our flagpole? Please give us a reasonable explanation." His expression was on point, as if he did not know what had happened. Yi Qian, who was staring at him, heard this and suddenly sneered. He looked at Maki Fujino with ridicule in his eyes. He wanted to play the innocent trick of pretending not to know anything. The Korean students were arrogant and stupid. Then, the Japanese students were despicable and shameless. They were shameless to this extent. Once again, they had broken the bottom line of shamelessness. Li Jinyan, who needed an explanation, lowered his eyes slightly and glanced at the Japanese students, who were about 10 centimeters shorter than him. His thin lips curled up slightly. His cold expression outlined a biting coldness. Just as he was about to speak, Yi Qian, who was standing beside him, stepped forward and spoke first. "You need an explanation from the Chinese? Are you qualified?" Yi Qian did not allow his instructor, Li Jinyan, to explain the situation to a foreign military student, because the other party was not qualified to listen to an explanation from a Chinese instructor. Hearing this, Li Jinyan, who was standing behind her, smiled faintly. She had said what he wanted to say. After doing such a shameless thing, he still tried to pretend that he didn't know anything to get away with it. The leader of the Japanese students seemed to be very confident in his IQ. Maki Fujino was very confident in his intelligence. He was confident that as long as Instructor Fong spoke to him, he would be able to anger him. Even if Instructor Fong wasn't angered, he was confident that he could make Instructor Fong say something unpleasant. If an instructor was agitated by a student and even said something unpleasant, then the character of the Chinese student and instructor would definitely be questioned. At that time, it wouldn't matter if the Chinese side accepted his apology or not. After all, the dignity of the Chinese side and their country had long been lost. But now, his new plan was interrupted once again. Maki Fujino's eyes flashed with malice as he looked at Yi Jian and questioned, "I'm talking to your instructor now. Please move aside." This female student had ruined his plans time and time again. He had to get rid of her. Chapter 3709. Maki Fujino, what you should be worried about now is whether your sun flag will be destroyed. Yi Qian looked coldly at the Japanese students who made him feel disgusted. His English was filled with murderous intent. You need to pay the price for your shameless actions. Pay the price? What kind of price would they have to pay? Did the Chinese students really think that they were as easy to bully as the Korean students? I don't understand what you're talking about. You took away our flagpole like robbers and now you want us to pay the price. Please take a good look. This is Monfei, not China. Please go back to your own country and be arrogant. Maki Fujino said in a deep voice. He controlled his facial expressions well. He was the type of person who said, "I'm very angry, but my self-restraint reminds me not to lose my temper." If someone who did not know the situation saw this, they might really be fooled by him. You knocked down our flag and tried to run it over with your car. Now you want to pretend that you don't know what happened? Maki Fujino, do you really think that we don't know your conspiracy? Yi Qian was too lazy to talk nonsense with this person. What could talk solve? Nothing could be solved. Maki Fujino, whose conspiracy was exposed, did not panic at all. He looked at the Chinese students with an expression that said, "Impossible, there's no such thing. I don't know anything." He frowned and said hesitantly, "We did feel that we hit something just now, but we didn't see it from the rearview mirror. Could it be that we hit your flag?" "I'm very sorry, very sorry." He bowed and his attitude changed 180 degrees. He apologized sincerely. "I'm very sorry. We really didn't notice it just now. If we did, we would have stopped the car. Please forgive us. We're very sorry." How could he do such a shameless thing? Tianqin wanted to rush up and give him a few slaps to vent the anger in her heart. The rest of the Chinese students were shocked by the gaze of their instructor, Li Jinyan. For the time being, Yi Qian would be the one to fight a battle of wits with Maki Fujino. However, Maki Fujino's sophistry made the Chinese students angry and worried at the same time. If he refused to admit it, the whole thing would become a stalemate. No matter how angry the Chinese students were, they could not do anything about it. In front of them, the Japanese students forcibly stopped the Chinese students, who took away their flagpoles. The Manfei soldiers who came to reinforce them with guns protected the Chinese students tightly to prevent the students from both sides from fighting. Fights between students from the two countries had happened before. "Please put down our flagpoles. You can't do something that will damage your image. What's the difference between your behavior and that of bandits? Please put down our flagpole. Thank you. We're sorry that your flagpole was hit, but you can't take our flagpole away. Please return it immediately. We need to complete the flag raising." At this moment, the Japanese students were huddled together in a united front. At this time, even if they knew that their own students were in the wrong, they could not back down. Once they backed down, their national flag would not be able to be raised. Seeing that the Chinese students refused to return the flagpole, Fukumoto Rina rushed from the back to the front like a mad dog and shouted at the top of her lungs, "Chinese students, you have already driven away Korea with barbaric behavior. Are you going to use barbaric behavior to deal with Japan now? We will not back down. Our Japanese soldiers will never back down even half a step." Chapter 37:10. Hirano Ridge, who finally ran over, was so angry that his cheekbones were twitching when he heard the roars of his own students. Anyone could see that they had deliberately knocked down the Chinese flag, and that they were deliberately not admitting what they had done. But now, they actually jumped out to accuse the Chinese students of being barbaric? Knocking down the flag of another country was already a very stupid act. They had already been caught by the Chinese, and yet they still wanted to escape responsibility. They even jumped out to accuse the Chinese. Did they want to be like the Korean students? Hirano Ridge adjusted his breathing and walked straight to the middle of the confrontation between the students of the two countries. He first bowed slightly to the Chinese students to express his apology. Then, he turned around and looked at the Chinese students with a cold face. "Since we broke the Chinese flagpole, we should be responsible and return the flagpole to the Chinese. They had already caused such a big trouble and still wanted to stop the Chinese from taking the flagpole. Did they want to make things worse?" Compared to Instructor Kim Jong-jae, Instructor Hirano Ridge's IQ was one level higher. He needed to turn big things into small things and small things into nothing. Therefore, he needed to show weakness first. Only by showing weakness could he calm the anger of the Chinese students. But this time, he was wrong. When a country's dignity was trampled on, only by ruthlessly returning the favor could they barely calm the anger in their hearts. The Chinese student Zhang Minghong walked to Hirano Ridge's side and said with a cold gaze, "We will report this matter to the arbitration committee and call your country's embassy at the same time. Deliberately knocking down our flag, and now accusing our Chinese students of being barbaric. The actions of your students have far exceeded our tolerance. No country's flag is sacred and inviolable. Alerting the embassy would inevitably alert the country. At that time, it would no longer be a conflict between students, but an issue between countries." Instructor Hirano Ridge's heart sank when he thought of bringing trouble to his country before he even got a place in the competition. I will negotiate with your instructors and bring our students to apologize to you. Hirano Ridge had already realized the seriousness of the situation. When the Japanese students behind him heard that they would directly report to the embassy, their faces changed. Obviously, they did not expect the situation to escalate to an issue between countries. Fukumoto Rina's fingers trembled as she turned to look at Fukumoto Maki, who was still standing beside Fong Shuedo. At this time, Maki Fukumoto's hands and feet were trembling as he stared at the Manfei soldier who was speaking. His chest was heaving up and down. All military Hummers used for the competition have surveillance cameras. Whether or not the Japanese students deliberately knocked down the Chinese flag, we might be able to find clues through the surveillance cameras. Now, please wait patiently. The officers of the arbitration committee will arrive very soon. Fearing that the Chinese students, in fact, the Chinese students from the Chinese students from the Chinese students arrived at the same time, on one hand, they were providing emergency support. The Chinese students were actually very restrained. Although they all wanted to rush up and beat up the Japanese scholar, they all held themselves back. If they really beat him up, even if they were reasonable, it would be unreasonable. They might even be bitten back by Japan. Maki Fujino glanced at the Hummer parked at the side, and a dark glint flashed across his eyes. There's actually surveillance. At that time, Maki Fujino pursed his lips tightly. Chapter 37:11. As long as he could not see the surveillance camera, then his conversation with Fukumoto Rina would not be known. Therefore, there was only one thing he needed to do next: destroy the surveillance camera. Just as Maki Fujino was thinking of ways to destroy the surveillance camera, he suddenly heard the Chinese instructor say to referee Manfei, "Before the surveillance camera is retrieved, our students need to be present. The Japanese students are not allowed to come close. After the surveillance camera is retrieved, our students will escort them. The Japanese students are not allowed to come close." Yi Qian, who noticed his trembling hands, coldly smirked and said, "The two Japanese students who were driving the military Hummer just now need to be further away. We will apply to isolate them separately until the surveillance camera is retrieved." Hearing this, Maki Fujino suddenly raised his head. His gaze seemed to have been dipped in the most sinister poison. His eyes were narrow, and with such a gaze, they looked more like a pair of poisonous snake eyes. He gritted his teeth and said coldly, "You have no right to isolate us. Not us, but the arbitration committee. They have the right to execute, and you have the obligation to cooperate." Hirano Ridge led all the Japanese students towards the Chinese side. Walking in front of them were Zhang Minghong and a few other Chinese students, who were holding a flagpole. Maki Fujino, who was still planning how to destroy the surveillance camera, heard footsteps behind him. He retracted his gaze and looked back at the instructor, Hirano Ridge, who was walking towards him. If he could not destroy the surveillance camera, perhaps the instructor could. The first thing Hirano Ridge did when he walked over was to give Maki Fujino a hard slap. This slap caused Maki Fujino's head to tilt to one side, and there were 5 fresh fingerprints on his face. Without giving Maki Fujino a chance to speak, Hirano Ridge, who knew the severity of the situation, loudly reprimanded him and asked him to apologize to the Chinese students. Fukumoto Rina was also with them. As Zhang Minghong said, the Chinese students did not accept their apology. Neither of them had the chance to apologize. Li Jinyan directly said to Hirano Ridge, "There is no need to apologize for things that cannot be solved with an apology. I hope that after the surveillance camera is retrieved, your students will continue to firmly believe that they did not do it on purpose." When the Japanese students who followed them heard that there were surveillance cameras in the car, they were all dumbfounded. There were surveillance cameras. Then, who was right and who was wrong could be judged through the surveillance camera. Hearing that there was a surveillance camera in the car, Lina Fukumoto's face turned pale on the spot. Was the entire conversation between her and Fujino-kun recorded? Wouldn't all of Fujino-kun's plans be exposed? 3 generals from the arbitration committee quickly arrived. One was a Russian general, one was an American general, and the last one was a Russian general. The 3 generals rushed to the scene in the same car with solemn expressions. The situation at the scene was very good. There was no chaos, but the atmosphere was very tense. It was as if an arrow had been pulled to the bowstring, and the slightest mistake would break the silence. Lina Fukumoto couldn't hold on any longer. "Calm down, Fubenkin." Maki Fujino, who could still hold on, reminded him in a very soft and cold voice. "Destroy the surveillance cameras, and we can escape." "How do we destroy it?" Fukumoto Rina asked anxiously with sweat on her forehead. At this time, the sky had gradually darkened, turning into a misty green color. Although people's faces could still be seen clearly, it was as if they were covered with a thin layer of gauze. It was impossible to see everyone's expression at first glance. Using the faint darkness of the night as a cover, Maki Fujino's face was gloomy as he spoke of his latest plan. "After the surveillance cameras are retrieved, we will use the rifles in our hands to create chaos. You will cover for us, and I will destroy the equipment in their hand." In a short period of time, the ruthless Maki Fujino had a new plan. Chapter 37:12. The rifles loaded with blanks were still in their hands, becoming Fujino Masuhiro's personal weapon. When Fukumoto Rina heard that he would destroy the equipment, she couldn't help but worry. Taking advantage of the fact that the general of the arbitration committee was still asking the referee and the Monfei soldiers about the situation, she lowered her voice and asked, "Fujino-kun, please tell me your detailed plan. I will definitely cooperate with you." Since he and Fujino-kun cooperated to knock down the Chinese flag, then he also had the responsibility to deal with the aftermath. He couldn't let Fujino-kun bear the responsibility alone. Only by bravely shouldering his own responsibility would he not lose the spirit of the samurai. Fukumoto Rina came from a samurai family, which was also very famous in the local area. Her ancestors had once come to the Chinese territory and committed countless crimes. To this day, not only did their family not feel ashamed, but they also felt proud of it. After the defeat, her ancestors returned to China. After they passed away, there was a diary among their belongings. It clearly recorded everything that their ancestors did in the Chinese territory. The words were full of a sense of superiority, and the word Shina was used again and again in the diary. At the same time, it constantly emphasized how noble the Japanese were and how they were above the Chinese at that time. This diary was kept as the glory of the Fukumoto family until today. When Fukumoto Rina came of age, her father solemnly handed this diary to her. Fukumoto Rina, who spent almost a week reading it, felt deeply proud of her ancestors and was proud of it. As time passed in the diary, Fukumoto Rina's ancestor left more and more bad news in the diary, until the day of the surrender, Fukumoto Rina's ancestor's diary stopped. He said that this was the biggest regret in his life, and this regret was given to him by the Chinese people. It made him disappointed in his life, and it also made him regret for the rest of his life after returning to China. Fukumoto Rina was originally from the right wing. After reading her ancestor's diary, her hostility towards the Chinese deepened. This was also the main reason why she dared to do such a bold thing. The Fukumoto family and the Fukumoto family were no different. The difference was that Fukumoto's grandfather was still a high-ranking official at that time. After the defeat, he was able to return to Japan. Similarly, because he didn't fulfill his wish, he also died of depression after returning to China. Before he died, he lamented that he didn't complete the great feat of the past. The two students from right-wing families shared the same hostility towards the Chinese side. Now that the matter was about to be exposed, they hated the Chinese side and its students even more. Hearing this, Maki Fujino said gloomily, Now, it's time to see who is more ruthless. Later, I will shout that I have been insulted by the Chinese student. Then, I will use this. He gently moved the rifle that was still on his body. I will use this to point it at my abdomen. I will use death to prove that we are innocent. As for you. Before he could finish his plan, Fukumoto Rina instantly understood. I got it. When the time comes, I'll also raise the rifle and aim it at my abdomen. My movement will be bigger than yours, attracting everyone's attention, and you'll take the opportunity to destroy the surveillance camera. Am I right? Yes, in fact, I wanted to shoot the bullet into the fuel tank of the Hummer and cause a fire in the vehicle, but I thought that military Hummers are bulletproof, so I had to give up. Since Rina Fukumoto could instantly understand his plan, it made Maki Fujino even more confident in his plan. Chapter 37:13. When the time came, he would shout loudly that he had been misunderstood and insulted by the Chinese student. Then he would raise his rifle and point it at his abdomen, using his own death to prove his innocence. This move could be said to be ruthless. However, the two of them who were whispering to each other did not notice that there was a pair of clear eyes watching them all the time, clearly seeing their little movements in the dark. Yi Qian's gaze did not move away from the two of them. Since the two of them were so cunning, now that it was time to retrieve the surveillance footage, she did not believe that the two of them would obediently wait for the surveillance footage to be retrieved. Moreover, the sky was gradually getting dark. It would be easy for the two of them to do something when the Monfei soldiers were not paying attention. Especially, they both moved the rifles on their bodies. Since they had already used their guns, it seemed that the two of them would not be too small. Using their guns? Yi Qian could not help but move the rifle on her shoulder. The rifle was a good weapon. Now it depended on how the two Japanese students would use it. However, there was still one more thing to do later. They had the flagpole in their hand. They had to raise the national flag again. The three senior generals of the arbitration committee had already understood the ins and outs of the whole matter. They were all soldiers who had been through a lot. They immediately saw through the two Japanese students' little trick. Since they refused to admit it, they could only retrieve the surveillance footage. Li Jinyan maintained his usual indifference throughout the whole process. When it was time to speak, he was concise and to the point. When it was not time to speak, he was indifferent. He became more and more imposing and was not easy to fool. If it was just a small conflict between students, it would be fine. However, this was a major matter that concerned the dignity of the country. It had to be resolved so that people would know that the country's dignity was inviolable. The arbitration committee had initially discussed making peace if they could. However, when they saw the strong tone in the instructor's words, they knew that there was no way to make peace. They could understand the feelings of the Chinese instructors and students. If it were their own national flag that was intentionally knocked down, as soldiers, they probably wouldn't be as calm as the Chinese instructors. Thinking of this, the senior general of Monfei, who had just dealt with the Korean students a few days ago, could not help but stare at the Japanese instructor, Hirano Ryu. He did not give him any face. I think there is no need to retrieve the surveillance footage. Just cancel all the results and disqualify them from the competition. Leave the competition venue immediately and return to your country. This was the result that the instructor, Hirano Ryu, did not want to hear. When he heard this, he could not help but become anxious. The Japanese students were also anxious. Tomorrow was the last day of the competition. If they were disqualified the day before, they would become an international joke, just like Korea. No, it was worse than Korea. At that time, the international community will shift all the recent public opinion against South Korea to Japan, and it will even embarrass Japan even more. No, they did not want to be an international joke. We have already apologized to the Chinese students for our mistakes. Why can't they forgive us just this once? China is a big country. Shouldn't they have a tolerant heart and forgive us for our mistakes? Matsuyama Michiko, a Japanese female student from the General Staff College, spoke. She was very calm. Even her eyes were very calm. She did not panic even though the current situation was unfavorable to the Japanese students. We were wrong. We are not like the Korean students who refuse to admit their mistake. Why are you questioning our sincerity? Chapter 37:14. Matsuyama Michiko first looked at the 3 senior generals of the arbitration committee, then at the referee of the assessment team, and finally at the instructor Lee Jinyan. He was a young lieutenant colonel who fit the image of a perfect Prince Charming in the hearts of the Japanese girls. If it weren't for the fact that they were on opposite sides, Matsuyama Michiko would have run over to him in casual clothes and asked for his contact information. Unfortunately, the two of them were destined to be on opposite sides. No matter how perfect they were, they could only regret it. Excuse me, why don't you accept our apology? Do you think we're not sincere enough? Then now. As she spoke, she suddenly crossed her hands in front of her lower abdomen and bowed deeply to Lee Jinyan. I'm very, very sorry. I'm very sorry about our mistake to you and the Chinese students. Please, forgive us this time, okay? Immediately after, another female student from the staff college, Mai Yoshida, also bowed deeply to express her apology. When the 2 female students did this, the rest of the students lowered their heads and apologized to the Chinese students once again. Even Fujinomaki and Fukuda Rina bowed their heads very sincerely. If lowering their heads could save them from being disqualified, then lowering their heads was fine. They could still tell which was more important and which was more important. This move was also played very well. In this way, if the Chinese side still didn't accept it, they would be somewhat narrow-minded. Matsuyama Michiko from the staff college did indeed intend to do so. She was reminded by her instructor, Hirano Ling, to stand up and use this move. At this moment, it seemed that this move was indeed useful. At least the 3 senior generals of the arbitration committee, who had been a little gloomy and cold just now, instantly eased up a lot. Compared to the Korean students who had been disqualified, the attitude of the Japanese students was much better. They were so good that they could at least see their sincerity. The Chinese students only had a cold expression on their faces. More than a dozen people exchanged glances and gestures secretly. Yi Qian nodded lightly, indicating that she could stand up directly, but she was pulled back by Zhang Minghong, who sighed softly. We can't let you always come out and make them hate you. When it comes to the dignity of our country, as soldiers, we must stand up bravely. Now that the 3 of you have made your stand, it's time for the students of our Shi to speak. A male student from Shirlu's group stepped forward. Let me say it. We'll let them know what our stance is. Hearing this, Yi Qian took half a step back and said solemnly to the student, All right. I'll leave it to you. Don't worry. Shirlu, who had nodded at the students from his country, pointed at the students from his country and walked up to instructor Lee Jinyan. Then, he said loudly, we can accept your apology, but you've misunderstood something. The flag that was knocked down is our national flag, so please bow down and apologize to our country's national flag. Then, he turned to Lee Jinyan and said, Instructor, let's raise the fallen national flag first. After the national flag is raised, the Japanese students can bow their heads and apologize to our country's national flag. Bowing to the flag of another country and apologizing, the Japanese students and their instructor, Hirano Ridge, looked as if they had heard something unbelievable. They stared at the Chinese participant in shock. They could apologize to the Chinese students for their actions, but they absolutely could not lower their heads to the Chinese flag. This was not an ordinary apology, but an act of humiliation and loss of the country. They could not accept such an apology. Chapter 37:15. Hearing this, Fukumoto Rina, who was still bending her waist, suddenly raised her head and puffed out her chest. If this person was a tame dog just now, then now he was a ferocious wolf. His eyes emitted a gloomy cold light. We can't accept your requests. Then I'm sorry, we can't accept your apology either, Shi Lu said coldly, nodded slightly at Li Jinyan, and returned to the line. Li Jinyan looked at Hirano Ridge. If your country's students accept, then please bow down and apologize to our country's flag. If not, the arbitration committee will handle it, and the embassy will negotiate as normal. Also, our country will hold a press conference on this matter. At that time, we hope to see your country's leaders apologize to our country on TV to the whole world. The Chinese students were only expressing their intentions. In that case, the Chinese instructors were expressing their ability to take action. Let the country's leaders apologize to China on TV then. Matsuyama Michiko had cold sweat on her forehead. They had deliberately lowered their posture to express their apology, but they had never thought that the Chinese side would refuse on the grounds that it was their country's flag that had crashed into their country's flag. The cunning Chinese students had once again turned the situation in their favor. However, the three high-ranking generals of the arbitration committee felt that the Chinese student was right. If a soldier couldn't even protect the dignity of his country, how could he be qualified to be a soldier? If a soldier couldn't even do this, he wouldn't be respected by other countries. In the face of the Chinese side's toughness, the three senior generals were not disgusted. Instead, they respected the Chinese side even more. The general from the fighting nation stood up. His attitude was just like their president. Besides being elegant, his methods and attitude were extremely domineering. What? You don't think it's good? Don't you like to bow down to others when you talk? Just now, I saw you leading your students to bow down and apologize to the Chinese students in the car. Why can't you bow down and apologize to the Chinese flag now? Now you've knocked down the Chinese flag, not the Chinese students. The Chinese students want you to apologize to their flag. I don't think there's any problem. You're willing to apologize to the Chinese students, but you're not willing to apologize to the Chinese flag that you've knocked down. In front of everyone, you're showing your sincerity in apologizing, heh? The general of the fighting race sneered. He didn't say anything else. In any case, everyone knew what he was talking about. Instructor Pinji Ling clenched his fists, but he did not want to bow to the Chinese flag. He also needed to understand the situation. He let out a heavy sigh. When he spoke, his entire spirit seemed to have withered. Please allow us some time. Thank you. The Chinese side needs to raise the flag again. I can give you time to think about it. After the Chinese side finishes raising the flag, you must give us a reply. If not, we will not stop the Chinese side from doing anything. Moreover, we will hand over the surveillance footage to the Chinese side. When the time comes, will the Chinese side post the surveillance footage directly at the press conference? Think about it yourself. Monfei's general spoke up. He was fed up with these students causing trouble for no reason. A small country was indeed a small country. They did not have the demeanor of a big country at all. Chapter 37:16. It was not easy to organize a large-scale international competition. If it was successful, it would add credit to his military career. However, if trouble kept appearing, his ability would be questioned and it would affect his future development. It might even be used by his political opponents as evidence to pull him down. The more he thought about it, the angrier General Monfei became. His face became gloomier and gloomier. He looked at the Japanese students with particularly cold eyes. You knocked down the Chinese flag because the Chinese students are stronger than you. Jealousy like the devil made you make a mistake. If you knock down the flag that the soldiers of any country have sworn to protect, I will understand whatever the Chinese side will do next. And you Japanese soldiers have shown me your despicable and shameless side. The two generals of the arbitration committee had spoken. Only the American general did not say anything. However, he stood up and said with a serious expression, give them some time to consider. I think they will give us an answer. The relationship between Japan and the United States was pretty good. At this time, the United States general stood up to help Japan as much as he could. There was nothing else he could do. He could only let the Japanese instructors and students hear less bad word. Hirano Ridge looked at the American general gratefully. Then, he bowed slightly to the generals of the three countries and the Chinese instructors. He turned around and asked Fukumoto Maki Fujino and Rina Fukumoto, who had caused so much trouble for his country. I will ask again. Did you say anything you shouldn't have in the car? He had to confirm. If they did not say anything, he would not be worried even if the surveillance footage was handed over to the Chinese side. At the same time, he would never lead his students to bow down to the Chinese flag and apologize. As a soldier, he would never do something like losing or humiliating his country. Maki Fujino and Rina Fukumoto lowered their heads and answered their instructors with silence. They did not say anything. Hirano Ridge knew that they had said something they should not have. Just as he was about to reprimand them, Maki Fujino said, "Destroy the surveillance footage, and this matter will be solved. Instructor, we need your cooperation." Idiot! Will the Chinese side give you a chance? Hirano Ridge asked. They will not give us any chance to touch the surveillance footage. Also, do you think we don't have to bow down to the Chinese flag and apologize? Matsuyama Michiko stood up. Instructor, the Chinese side has already raised their flag. We will also raise our flag first. When the flags of both countries are raised, we will discuss how to solve this problem. Matsuyama Michiko was buying time for her country. This was the best idea she could come up with. Yes, now was the time to think of a solution. As soon as Wild Ridge said that, the American general saw through his plan and secretly reminded him, China will not give you too much time to delay, nor will they give you time to delay. Bow down to their country's flag and apologize. I think this is the best solution. Regardless of whether the Chinese side would give them a chance to stall for time, they would stall for time. Pinji Ling nodded and said solemnly, "We will have the best solution. Now, there is one more thing. Our country's flag can't be raised without a flagpole." When Japan wanted to raise their national flag, the Chinese side didn't stop them. In the night, when the Chinese flag was slowly raised again, Li Jinyan said, "Salute." The Chinese students lined up and saluted the raised flag. Chapter 37:17. It was late at night. The figures of the Chinese students were as straight as the rifles they had placed beside their left thighs. They were solemn and awe-inspiring. They were like pine trees standing on a cliff. Although they were facing the abyss, they were fearless. No matter how strong the wind or how cold the snow was, it could not suppress their straight back. These were the soldiers of the Chinese side. They stood between heaven and earth, tempered by fine steel, unyielding and unyielding. At that moment the whole place was silent. Even the three generals of the arbitration committee were shocked by the imposing manner of the Chinese students. They stared at the Chinese flag. The Japanese soldiers also stood upright and stared at the Chinese flag as if they were staring at their own flag. This scene was captured by the accompanying war correspondent. He took the picture from behind the Chinese students. The back view of all the Chinese students was captured in the camera. In front of the camera, the blood-red and solemn national flag was also captured. Later on, this photo became the most representative photo of the battlefield. Even though there were only a dozen soldiers, they had the majestic aura of a magnificent army. From the photo, one could see the iron bones of the Chinese soldiers, as well as the majesty of a rising country. Japan then completed the flag-raising ceremony. Perhaps due to the comparison of the Chinese students and the fact that the Japanese students were preoccupied, the entire flag-raising ceremony was not as solemn as the Chinese. After the flag-raising ceremony of the two countries, the arbitration committee did not receive a reply from the Japanese. The Chinese students were not surprised by this result. Soon, a technical soldier jumped into the car and began to pull up the surveillance footage. Li Jinyan was in the car. Outside the car were Yi Qian, Zhang Minghong, Jiang Yang, and Li Xiang. Outside the car were the other Chinese students. Maki Fujino and Rina Fukumoto, who were isolated, exploded from their silence. It should be said that they exploded according to the plan. They did not directly target the Chinese students like the Korean students. Instead, they used suicide to complain about the unfair treatment. Hirano Ridge agreed to half of Maki Fujino's plan. However, he did not agree to destroy the surveillance footage. The reason he agreed to it was very simple. He wanted to buy more time to think of a solution. When Maki Fujino pointed the rifle in his hand at his abdomen and shouted that they were treated unfairly, Yi Qian smiled coldly. Previously, he and Fukumoto Rina were whispering in each other's ears to discuss how to put on such a show. Looking at the instructor Hirano Ling's secretly relieved expression, the coldness at the corner of Yi Jian's lips deepened. Rina Fukumoto did the same. She pointed the gun at her abdomen and shouted with her eyes red, "Just because we did not intend to do so, we are humiliated. I would rather kill myself than bow and apologize to the Chinese flag. Put your guns down, do you hear me? Put your guns down." Was. But the referee and the soldiers told them with certainty that the two Japanese students in the car must have heard the warning, but they didn't stop the car. It was obvious that they did it on purpose. The Manfei soldiers were all aiming their guns at the two Japanese students. It was as if they were ready to shoot as soon as the two students made any dangerous moves. Chapter 37:18. Fujino Maki was much calmer than Fukumoto Rina. He was just making a move and did not really want to hurt himself. It would be bad if he got too excited and accidentally hurt himself. The scene was very chaotic. Everyone was focusing on how to make the Japanese students put down their guns instead of pursuing the responsibility of the Japanese students. Facing the crazy Japanese students, the general of Manfei was so angry that his facial muscles were trembling. He turned his head and gritted his teeth at Hirano Ridge. "What are you trying to do? Are you trying to use this method to stop the Chinese from retrieving the surveillance footage? Do you think that by doing this, I will believe that you are innocent? No, you are wrong. Your current actions make me believe that the Japanese students are jealous of the Chinese students. They did not have the ability to challenge the Chinese students, and in the end, they thought of hitting the Chinese flag to vent their jealousy. Your shameful actions should be condemned by the whole world. I will absolutely not allow you to continue making trouble for no reason. Immediately order your students to stop their ridiculous behavior. Otherwise, I don't mind executing your students on the charge of assault with a gun." Hirano Ridge kept wiping his forehead as if he was wiping away his sweat. Hearing this, he did not explain anything and walked towards the two students who had lost their minds. Aiming the rifle at his abdomen, Hirano Ridge seemed to have lost control of his emotions. He was very worried that they would really shoot at his abdomen. He only wanted to stall for time and did not want the students to get hurt. After getting closer, he knew that his worries were unnecessary. Fujino Maki looked into the Hummer and Hirano Ridge's eyebrows twitched. "I need your cooperation, instructor," Fujino Maki said softly. "I will use a blank cartridge to hit the surveillance box. As long as the surveillance footage is destroyed, it will be beneficial to us." The ultimate goal was to destroy the surveillance footage. Currently, only the two involved and Hirano Ridge knew about the plan. The rest of the Japanese students were really frightened, so the atmosphere was very tense. Yi Qian, who had been standing guard in the Hummer, stared at the two who were still making a scene. When the two were making a scene and moving their feet, Yi Qian narrowed his eyes slightly. When Fujino Maki stood in front of him, Yi Qian instantly understood what the other party was trying to do. Suicide was fake. Using the blank cartridge in the rifle to destroy the surveillance footage was real. They want to use a blank cartridge to destroy the surveillance footage. Brother, do you want to cooperate with them? It's been so long, but it hasn't been resolved. It's time to put an end to it. Not only do we want them to bow their heads and apologize to our flag, we also want them to suffer the consequences of their actions. Li Jinyan, who had already obtained the surveillance footage but had yet to get out of the car, raised his eyebrows slightly. What do you want to do? Our flag was knocked down by them, so I'll knock down their flag directly. Fair enough. Yes, that's fair. Now there's an opportunity to make a move. You have to cooperate. We have to let them shoot first so that I can shoot. Yi Qian, whose words were laced with coldness, retracted his gaze and lowered his eyelids slightly to hide the hostility in the room. Let's settle this quickly. Go back and rest early to prepare for tomorrow. Sure, I'll cooperate. Li Jinyan lowered his head and looked at the small black box in his hand. He moved his finger and the small black box opened. He took out a small magnetic disc and put it in his pocket before pushing the door open and getting out of the car. In his eyes, the suicide threat of the two Japanese students was just child's play. There was no need to panic. Chapter 37:19. When Yi Qian saw him get out of the car, he followed closely behind. Noticing that Maki Fujino had not committed suicide after a long time, he pretended to cooperate with Hirano Ridge and turned the rifle around instead of pointing the muzzle at his abdomen. Yi Qian's lips curled into a cold, murderous smile. Finally, the biggest show was about to begin. Maki Fujino, who had been waiting for a long time, saw Li Jinyan holding a small black box in his hand. With a cold glint in his eyes, he said to Hirano Ridge, "Instructor Fong has already gotten out of the car. Instructor, please cooperate with me. I'll shout 1, 2, 3. When I shout 3, immediately come over and snatch the rifle from me." If not for the fact that the Chinese side wanted their country's students to bow their heads and apologize to the Chinese flag, Hirano Ridge would not have taken such a risk. Since the chaos had already been created, it would not have been so obvious if they accidentally fired. Regardless of whether it was intentional or not, as long as they did not admit it, they only needed to apologize. Hirano Ridge finally nodded his head gently and agreed to the plan of the two students. However, he did not know that with his nod, what would happen next would make them feel humiliated and helpless. Li Jinyan, who had deliberately stood aside to let Maki Fujino shoot, said to the three generals of the arbitration committee indifferently, "There are a total of 22 countries participating in the competition. We can first invite the students and instructors of the 22 countries to watch the surveillance footage together." He waved the small black box in his hand and said, "As for." At the same time, the small black box exploded, and Maki Fujino was knocked away. A sudden gunshot was heard amidst the chaos. Bang! It hit the window of the Hummer, leaving a very small mark. Yi Qian, who had been prepared for this, immediately pointed his gun at Fukumoto Rina after knocking Li Jinyan away. 3 bullets were fired consecutively, hitting the rifle in Rina's hand that was still aimed at her abdomen. Gunshots rang out and the scene was once again chaotic. Hirano Ridge, who had yet to snatch the rifle from Maki Fujino's hand, was shocked by the sound of another gunshot. However, he could not care less about Rina Fukumoto. He gritted his teeth and snatched the rifle from Maki Fujino. At the same time, he unloaded the magazine and shot Maki Fujino. When Maki Fujino saw that he had destroyed the surveillance camera, he was willing to be beaten up. He even said to his instructor, "You must hit me hard. It's best if you break my ribs. We must be ruthless to ourselves." Rina Fukumoto was frightened by the bullet. The nearby Manfei soldiers seized the opportunity to rush over and threw her to the ground. They twisted her hands and took the rifle from her hands. The 3 generals of the arbitration committee were already under the protection of the Manfei soldiers. When the three of them saw the rifles in the hands of the two suicidal Japanese students, the three of them walked out of the protective circle with dark faces. Blanks were equally lethal at a distance of 3 to 5 meters. Moreover, they were only about 4 meters away from each other. A bullet to the head would be fatal. Bastard! Bastard! Hirano Ridge was still using the rifle in his hand to viciously hit Maki Fujino. It seemed that this was the only way to quell the anger in his heart. At this moment, none of the Japanese students stepped forward to persuade him. Although they couldn't bear to see Maki Fujino get beaten up, they knew that if they didn't do this, there would only be more troublesome things happening. Fortunately, the surveillance footage had been destroyed. Now, they only needed to apologize. They no longer had to worry about the surveillance footage being released by the Chinese side. Chapter 37:20. Don't worry, Instructor Hirano Ridge. What you hoped for did not happen. Li Jinyan walked up to Hirano Ridge, who was violently beating up his students. I have already obtained the surveillance footage. Now, it's time for you to apologize. As he spoke, his slender fingers opened up, revealing a small magnetic disc in his palm. Maki Fujino, who had been beaten until his vision was black, fiercely raised his head to look over. He only saw Li Jinyan's hand, but he didn't see the magnetic disc. However, Instructor Hirano Ridge saw it. His pupils contracted fiercely, and there was a hint of viciousness in his eyes. The Chinese side must have seen through their plan. Otherwise, they would not have taken out the magnetic disc in advance. The three generals of the arbitration committee walked over. The general of the Monfei military was completely displeased with Japan. He shouted loudly, "Instructor Hirano Ridge, the Chinese flag is in front of you. Bring your students and apologize." He was not the only one who lost his patience. The Russian general had also lost his patience. There was even a hint of disgust in his words. You only have one choice. Apologize to the Chinese flag. No, they still have a second choice. Li Jinyan, who was looking down, spoke softly. Maki Fujino, whose face was distorted, stared at him intently, waiting for him to say what the second choice was. Since our students have caused resentment in your hearts due to winning against you, our students suggest that each of you carry the signal flag. No matter how you run, if the student who is holding a gun can't shoot down the coordinate flag in the opponent's hand within 5 shots, you will have to stand under the flag of the winning side and apologize. The flag of the losing side will be under the flag of the winning side. After this, no matter who wins or loses, I will immediately destroy the magnetic disc in my hand and will not pursue the matter of you shooting just now. Everything will end here. Accept the challenge or apologize immediately. Choose for yourself. There was still half a chance that they would not have to apologize if they accepted the challenge. If they did not accept the challenge, they would have to apologize immediately. Maki Fujino, who was very confident in his shooting skills, endured the pain in his ribs and nodded almost without hesitation. Instructor Hirano Ridge wanted to use the excuse that his students were almost shot to request for a change of target. Perhaps he would request that the Chinese side not send Yi Qian as the shooter. However, he was stopped by the American general with his eyes. Taking advantage of the chaos to shoot and destroy the surveillance camera's small black box, this already represented a guilty conscience. The previous matter had not been resolved, and now there was a new problem. Japan did not have any chance to speak. They could only accept. If he accepted it, there was still some hope left. Why did China choose to use Japan's flag? It was because they wanted to use the same method to take revenge. However, whether or not China could succeed in taking revenge depended on their own ability. Since the condition was proposed by Yi Qian, it was only natural that Yi Qian would accept the challenge. The Chinese students believed in Yi Qian's shooting skills, but they looked up at the flag fluttering in the wind, which was the same size as the national flag. They were still a little worried. The area of the coordinate flag was very large, and they were worried that they would be hit. However, their worries were unnecessary. This was the maximum range of a rifle, and it was not certain if the bullet could hit the target. The Japanese students were very nervous. When they heard the Chinese student, Yi Qian, running ahead with the coordinate flag, their hearts almost jumped into their throats. Hirano Ridge, who was standing on Yi Qian's side, started to regret using too much force. He should not have used the butt of his rifle to hit Maki Fujino. In order to cooperate with this contest of national dignity, Japan's military switched on the night lights. The lights were turned on, and the scene was as bright as day. Yi Qian was already running. Within 5 minutes, Maki Fujino had fired 5 shots. Chapter 37:21. When the first gunshot rang out, everyone's breathing became tense. The Chinese students clenched their fists and lined up neatly as they stared ahead. After a pause, Maki Fujino steadily fired the second bullet. When he finished firing 5 bullets, he put away his rifle and wiped the sweat off his forehead. He then gestured to the Chinese students who were watching nervously, indicating that he was very confident. In an instant, the Japanese students' previous depression was swept away, and they all smiled. If Fujino-kun won, then they would not have to bow down to the Chinese flag and admit their mistake. Now, they only had to worry about whether the Chinese student Yi Qian would shoot at their flag. Hopefully, she would not be able to shoot. Hirano Ling was sweating profusely. He had completed the inspection of the Chinese flag. There were no bullet holes on it, not a single bullet hole. Maki Fujino did not shoot. He had lost. He had lost. The students from the 2 countries were divided into 2 groups. One group stood with the shooter and the other group stood with the flag bearers. When the students standing with the flag bearers saw that there was not a single bullet hole on the flag, their expressions were contrasting. The Japanese students' faces were ashen, but the Chinese students' faces were filled with joy. Hirano Ling, who was holding the flag tightly, could not help but tremble. Li Jinyan, who did not touch the flag at all, saw this and walked to Hirano Ling's side. He said fiercely, "There are no bullet holes on it. You have lost. We will use our own method to make you lower your flag." His voice was so cold that it made Hirano Ling's hands tremble. He trembled as he returned the flag to the Chinese student. The Chinese? What method would they use to make them lower their flag? The other corner of the flag was held by the Russian general. After checking it, he gave the corner of the flag to the Chinese student beside him for safekeeping. A few Japanese students with ashen faces welcomed Maki Fujino. Facing Maki Fujino, who was walking briskly towards them, they could not help but lower their eyes in pain. Before he got close, Maki Fujino could feel the pain of the Chinese student. He could not help but stop in his tracks. His excited heart gradually sank. He wanted to ask, but the Russian soldier did not give him the chance. He took the other flag from the Chinese student and was urged to leave. "Please don't let the Chinese hit the flag in your hand. Thank you." As he turned around, he finally heard the reminder from the Chinese student. It was this reminder that made him realize that he had failed. However, an even greater failure was yet to come. While he was running wildly, the first gunshot rang out. Then, he heard the sound of the flagpole cracking. He raised his head to look, and his expression changed drastically. The flagpole had been hit. His mad dash was even more intense, and the flagpole was broken. Just as he thought of this, the second spear shot out. Gotcha! The flagpole was completely broken, and Maki Fujino saw the flag fluttering high up in the air, rapidly falling down. He immediately threw away the broken flagpole in his hand and tried to grab the broken flagpole that still had the flag hanging on it. When all the Japanese students saw this scene, the broken flagpole seemed to be pressing down on their backs, and the pain on their faces deepened. However, this was not the end of their suffering. 3 consecutive bang 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 sounds rang out. 3 bullet holes suddenly appeared in the center of the coordinate flag that was fluttering in the wind. Not only did the Chinese students break their flagpole, but they also used their terrifying shooting skills to shoot 3 bullets at the flag when the broken flagpole fell with the flag. When the Japanese students saw the coordinates flag with 3 bullet holes on it, they burst into tears. Chapter 37:22. As the instructor, Hirano Ridge had an ominous premonition when he heard the cries of the students. Before the contest, Li Jinyan had already informed the Japanese instructor, Hirano Ridge, and all the Japanese students of the rules. There were 2 choices for the Japanese students to choose from. Now it seemed that no matter which choice they chose, it would be very disadvantageous for the Japanese. No, it should be said that when Fujino-kun chose to have a rematch and the loser took the initiative to stand under the flag of the winner and apologize, this choice was even more humiliating than immediately apologizing. It was even more humiliating for the country. It also confirmed that the Chinese students were stronger than the Japanese students. It further highlighted how narrow-minded they were and how they knocked down the Chinese flag out of jealousy. From the moment Fujino-kun made the choice to recontest, they were in an abyss that they could not turn over. The Chinese students above the abyss looked at them as if they were clowns. The Japanese students who were holding the coordinate flag with 3 bullet holes on it cried until they were almost howling. They agreed to compete with the Chinese because they did not want to bow to the Chinese flag. But now, there was no excuse for them anymore. They could no longer find any excuse to escape. In the face of the wailing of his own students, Fujino-kun seemed to have lost all his vitality. He knelt on the ground and his whole body was so dispirited that his back was bent. Suddenly, he hugged his head and knelt on the ground in extreme pain. Then, he pounded the ground with his hands in agony. Again and again, he pounded the ground fiercely. The various emotions that he had no place to express could only be expressed in this way. Under the white light, one could clearly see that his whole body was twitching in pain. If they lost, they had to admit it. If they did not admit it, they would only be embarrassed. At the same time, it would make the Chinese side look more tolerant and magnanimous. Hirano Ridge took a deep breath. At this time, as the instructor, he could not fall. He had to stand up and preside over the situation. Before he finished taking a deep breath, the general of the Monfei military spoke to him coldly in heavily accented English. Now, please immediately gather the students of your country, put down your country's flag, and bow to the Chinese flag to apologize. As if he did not believe in Hirano Ridge's character, he added very seriously, "This is your own choice. We are all witnesses. You can no longer escape. Also, the Chinese instructors are very tolerant. Whether you lose or they win, they will not release the surveillance video. I think you have won. The Chinese side gave you a choice, so you've already won. If it were any other powerful country, it would be hard to say if the students of Japan would be able to leave this place alive. It sounds like a fair persuasion, but in fact, it can be regarded as a threatening warning. Because Monfei's military officers don't believe in the character of all the contestants from Japan, he has to do this. How could the Flatfield Ridge not know? Therefore, he had to admit defeat. The Japanese students who were standing at the shooting position ran over with joy. They still remembered that after their own student, Fujino-kun, finished shooting, he gave them a victory sign and told them that he would definitely win. Therefore, they all had smiles on their faces as they ran. Even their running steps were so relaxed. But as they ran closer and closer, the smiles on their faces instantly froze when they heard the howls of their own students. They seemed to have realized something, and after a short pause in their running speed, they began to run wildly. Like a gust of wind, they ran closer in the blink of an eye. Chapter 37:23. They were overjoyed because of Maki Fujino's action. They saw Maki Fujino kneeling on the ground in pain, as well as the students from their own country who were howling beside the coordinate flag. Their howling was like a heavy hammer that was swung in midair, smashing into their chests without warning. It smashed into their stiff smiles and slowed down their pace until they could no longer take another step. Why were they crying in pain? Was it because they lost? Lost? Did they lose? The Japanese students who did not dare to take another step forward looked at each other. Fear gradually emerged in their eyes, drowning everyone like a tide. Lost, they lost. They had to choose again, and the result was still, they lost. The instructor, Pinji Ling, whistled. His voice was very sharp, and he used so much force that it could break the whistle made of stainless steel. The Japanese students who were one step ahead of Yi Qian and the Chinese students heard the whistle and finally took the step that they did not dare to take. Tianqin couldn't help but whistle. She smiled at Yi Jian and said, "This is so satisfying. This is so satisfying. Now, they will have to obediently bow down to our flag. Oh, and they will have to lower their own flag too. It's so satisfying. There's more to come." Yi Qian, who broke the flagpole that represented the winner and the loser and left 3 bullet holes on the flag, did not let the Japanese off the hook. She lowered her eyes slightly and said coldly, "There's more to come." The Chinese instructor, Li Jinyan, who was also her big brother, said, "The loser's flag is in the winner's request. The loser's flag must be lowered immediately." This sentence was just like a Chinese sentence when spoken in English. Why did they have to compete with the Japanese? It was so that they could dig a deeper hole. Did they really think that they could lower their own flag and lower their heads to apologize to our flag? Wrong. The flagpole was broken and could not be repaired. In that case, the Japanese students had to open their eyes wide and see how the Chinese students would break their flagpole and make their flag fall to the ground. Tianqin and the other Chinese students became even more excited when they heard that there was more to come. They were going to vent their anger in front of the arbitration committee. What other way is there? I really want to know now. Can you tell me? Can you tell me? Tianqin couldn't help asking. She was so excited that she couldn't hide the smile in her eyes. Yi Qian chuckled. "You'll see soon enough. We don't care about scheming, but when it comes to playing, they can only kneel." Sun Tzu's core art of war. The art of war is the art of trickery. If you want to play trickery with the Chinese side, then let's see who can outplay who. At this moment, the Japanese students had finished lining up and were waiting for Yi Qian and the others to return. So the students once again lined up under the national flag and saluted solemnly. Behind them were the Japanese students who were lining up neatly with their heads bowed in apology. They were unwilling, but they had to lower their heads and apologize. The war reporters took pictures of this scene. When the Chinese students returned to China, the pictures were also brought back and kept. After the salute, it was time to lower the sun flag of Japan. Hirano Ridge had an ominous feeling in his heart. When he saw the Chinese female student Yi Qian standing in the last row and swinging her gun, his eyelids twitched violently. The Chinese side is definitely going to make some big moves, definitely. Why would they be so kind as to give the Japanese a choice? From the moment they made the choice, it would be the beginning of the Chinese side's revenge. Chapter 37-24. Not only was Hirano Ridge's eyelids twitching violently, his heart was also flustered. There must be a conspiracy, there must be a conspiracy. The Chinese side would not destroy the surveillance tape so easily, nor would they erase everything just because they bowed their heads and apologized to the Chinese flag. Hirano Ridge, who was flustered all the way, remained calm on the surface. He arranged for the students to take down the flag. Since it was Fujino Masaki and Fukumoto Rina who caused the trouble, he would let them deal with the aftermath. Thus, Hirano Ridge arranged for the two of them to lower the sun flag. Hirano Ridge also had a small plan for this arrangement. He hoped that the Chinese side would let the two students who caused the trouble lower the Japanese flag because he had already cooperated with them. He hoped that they would not use any other trick. At this moment, the students who wanted to see their country's flag lowered were all severely suppressed. Everyone's mood was very depressed, and it might even affect tomorrow's competition. The instructor, Hirano Ridge, only hoped that after the flag was lowered, they could immediately rest and not do anything unbearable to the students. Under the humiliated expression of the Japanese students, Fujino Masaki and Fukumoto Rina gritted their teeth and walked with heavy footsteps to the sun flag that was fluttering in the wind. The two stood still and looked at each other, then slightly nodded. They looked like they were about to die. One lowered his head and held the flagpole, while the other lowered his head and pulled down the sun flag. The Japanese students below first looked up at their sun flag. When the flag was lowered, everyone lowered their heads tightly, and tears flowed out from their eyes. The Japanese students standing in the last row suddenly heard a voice behind them. When you deliberately hit our country's flag, have you ever thought about the grief and indignation that we, as soldiers, felt? Using the Code of Hammurabi? A passage from the Bible, Unyielding for an Anatuchfaradish tooth. We are just using the same method to tell you how we felt at that time. The one who said this was Tianqin. She calmly said the passage from the Bible. The Japanese students who heard it suddenly froze. An eye for an Anatuchfaradish, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. This was the principle that the Chinese students taught the Japanese to be a human being. Tianqin had originally wanted to say, "Don't rush to do what you want others to do," but it was a little difficult to translate this into English, so she thought of borrowing this passage from the Code of Hammurabi. Obviously, the Japanese students, whose backs were stiff, understood. The Japanese students, who had their heads lowered, did not notice that when they were about to lower the sun flag, Yi Chien had already raised the rifle in her hand. Hirano Ridge, who had been watching her from the corner of his eye, saw her move and was shocked. His expression was more frightened than ever. He seemed to have thought of something and shouted in his native language, "Please stop." Unfortunately, it was already too late. An eye for an Anatuchfar a tooth, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. What it really meant was that, if you did something to me, I would do the same to you. Our flag was deliberately broken by you, so your country's flag must be broken too. Do you think you can make up for it by lowering your heads and admitting your mistakes and putting down your national flags? Naive. Now, it was the time to break it off. Even though Hirano Ridge had realized what Yi Chien wanted to do in time, he was powerless to stop Yi Chien's true intentions. He screamed in horror, but Yi Chien, with a cold gaze, fired 3 shots. Chapter 37:25. Bang, bang, bang. There was no pause in the middle, and 3 bullets were fired in a calm manner. Maki Fujino, who was holding onto the flagpole, first heard the instructor Hirano Ridge's roar of shock, then he heard gunshots. Before the other Japanese students could react to the gunshots, Maki Fujino heard a familiar "kacha" sound from above his head. This sound, his heart skipped a beat, and he looked up at the sky in horror. He saw the Japanese flag, which represented the Japanese nation, falling down with a broken flagpole. No! Seeing his nation's flag falling down in such a manner, Maki Fujino felt as if a large piece of his heart had been dug out. It was so painful that his eyes were about to pop out of their socket. He opened his arms and tried to catch the falling Japanese flag. Fukumoto Rina's reaction was slightly slower, and before she could look up, the Japanese flag, together with the broken flagpole, fell to the ground beside her feet. Dust flew up, and under the illumination of the snow-white lights, it was as if everything was an illusion. With just a blink of an eye, everything in front of them would be destroyed. The broken flagpole was pressing down on the messy Japanese flag, and Maki Fujino, who opened his arms but failed to catch it, stared blankly at the ground. His kneeling action seemed to be in slow motion. Fukumoto Rina, who finally reacted, was stunned. Broken? The flagpole was broken? In other words, the gunshots that she heard just now were actually the gunshots that broke their flagpole? Who did it? Who did it? Fukumoto Rina, whose eyes were red, roared, "Who did it? Who did it? Get out here! Get out here!" His furious roar woke up all the Japanese students, and the students in the front row had already rushed to the broken flag. It was not an illusion, and the Japanese students did not see wrongly. Their Japanese flag was indeed hit by Yi Qian's 3 bullets, and then it fell to the ground. This was the real an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. The scene in front of them made the Chinese students completely vent their anger. If not for the fact that the scene was not suitable for applause, they would have clapped and celebrated. Yi Qian directly used bullets to break the flagpole of the Japanese flag. Ha ha ha, this is so satisfying! The Chinese students had vented their anger, but the Japanese students were furious. Yi Qian put away his rifle, while Li Jinyan stood beside Pinji Ling, who had been angered by the scene in front of him, and said calmly, "This is your own choice. Do you want to act shamelessly again? I'll give you a choice. The loser's flag will be immediately lowered at the request of the winner. I've told you very clearly that the 3 generals of the arbitration committee can testify. You're using this kind of method to ask us to surrender? You are shameless and despicable." Flatfield Ridge could not face this matter calmly. He could not accept such a thing. His rage was met with a cold glare from Li Jinyan. "Mr. Hirano, how did your students break our country's flag? Shameless and despicable, I think that's more suitable for you. Just now, my student said something, and I'll repeat it to you now, an eye for an and a tooth for a tooth. We're just doing the same thing you did to us. In China, this is called reciprocity. I know you can understand Chinese, so don't pretend that you can't understand." The 3 generals of the arbitration committee were actually shocked by the Chinese students' actions. They did not have time to do anything, and the Chinese students had already finished shooting. At this moment, the anger of the Chinese students had subsided, and the angry Japanese students were easy to deal with. After all, they were in the wrong first. Chapter 37-26. In the face of the angry Japanese students, the 3 generals of the arbitration committee had a high degree of agreement. After a brief exchange of glances, the senior general of the Manfei military stood up and confirmed that the Chinese instructor had indeed said that. He said in a very serious and solemn tone, "The Chinese instructor did say that, but you didn't ask clearly and immediately agreed. Therefore, you can't blame the Chinese side. You should know that if you won, the Chinese side would bow and apologize to your Sun flag and lower their flag. Now, the Chinese side won, so you have to abide by the rules set before the competition. Who wanted to solve this matter the most? It was undoubtedly the senior general of the Manfei military. He had enough of this kind of trouble caused by jealousy. He really had enough. After the disqualification of Korea, there were a few days of peace. Even if some countries were jealous of the strong Chinese students, they didn't do anything that gave him a headache. He thought that until the end of the competition, there wouldn't be any more incidents like the Korean students. He really thought so. In the end, reality gave him a hard slap in the face. The Japanese students had caused him trouble again, and this trouble was even bigger than the trouble caused by the Korean students. They deliberately broke the Chinese flag, and even made up their minds not to admit it. When the most important evidence was produced, they even dared to destroy the evidence. Now, the Chinese side finally stopped pursuing their shameless behavior, but in the end, they were angry because the Chinese side told them how to behave again. Angry my ass. What right do you have to be angry? An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. The Chinese instructor was right. The Chinese side would naturally treat them the same way they treated the Chinese side. Could it be that only the Chinese side was allowed to swallow their anger and not allow them to get what they deserved? The senior general of the Manfei military was completely on the side of the Chinese side. He was just short of pointing at Hirano Ridge's nose and telling him that he had to accept the Chinese flag and that there were no more conditions for negotiation. because the Japanese, who were the first to do something shameless, had no right. The words of the senior general of the Monfei military made Hirano Ridge feel that they were being treated differently from the Chinese side. However, he couldn't refute that the Chinese students had shot their flagpole with bullets, but he wanted to regain their dignity by bowing their heads and apologizing to the Chinese flag. Our students have already stood under their Chinese flag and apologized. Now, shouldn't they do the same? The Russian general laughed as if he had heard a joke. You're mistaken. These are two completely different things. You bowed to the Chinese flag and apologized because you did it on purpose. The Chinese students shot your flagpole because you lost the contest. They did it within the rules of the competition. Therefore, you have no right to ask the Chinese students to apologize to your Sun flag. You need to separate the two things clearly. You can't mix them up into one thing. Also, if you want the Chinese side to release the CCTV in the car to let the whole world know about the behavior of the Japanese students, you can continue to pester them. Oh, that's right. I have to remind you that if you continue to pester us, you will be disqualified from the competition. This is not a threat, it's a fact, and we are punishing you based on the facts. Do you still want to continue? Sure. Let's give it a try then. Chapter 37:27. The instructor, Pinji Ling, was completely at a disadvantage. The American general told him, "If you still want to compete, you should accept the truth. The truth started from your students' intentional mistake. You have no reason to absolve yourselves. If I were you, I would use another method to regain my dignity, and not in this kind of situation where you have no reason to absolve yourselves. The Chinese students are just using their actions to tell you that they will treat you the same way you treat them. There is nothing wrong with that." This sentence slowly suppressed the anger in Hirano Ridge's heart. He knew very well that it was indeed his students who were in the wrong first. He also knew very well that it was impossible for the Chinese to stand under their Sun flag and admit their mistake. However, there were some things that had to be tried. Perhaps they could succeed. After the test, the Chinese attitude was completely different from before. It was so strong that it made the Monfei generals who had previously neglected them retreat. It was also so strong that it made the Russian generals praise it. It also made the American generals, who had always been on their side, think that the Chinese did not do anything wrong this time. The whole situation was in favor of the Chinese, and the Japanese had no advantage at all. Therefore, he could only give up and endure the humiliation brought by the Chinese students. I understand. Hirano Ridge nodded unwillingly. He immediately gathered all the students and did not continue to be entangled in this matter. As long as they did not withdraw from the competition, they still had the opportunity to use the most effective way to let the Chinese students know that the Japanese soldiers would not easily bow down. When the Japanese students who were confronting the Chinese students heard the command to gather, the atmosphere was so tense that it was on the verge of exploding. They knew that they had lost this confrontation again. Some of the Japanese students expressed that they were not convinced. They only stopped when Hirano Ridge glared at them. The Chinese students always stood at the front, protecting Yi Qian behind everyone. The Japanese students could not even see the corner of Yi Qian's clothes. Hirano Ridge once again gave the command loudly. The Japanese students who had put away the Sun flag angrily had no choice but to give up. After gathering, Hirano Ridge suddenly turned around and walked towards Li Jinyan. His steps were very big, so heavy that every step he took could be heard. Everyone, including the Japanese students, thought that he was going to do something. He stopped a short distance away from the flat ridge, so that he could look at Li Jinyan, who was taller than him. Li Jinyan also looked at him indifferently. They only looked at each other, but he didn't ask if there was anything else. No one knew what Hirano Ridge was thinking. After looking at each other for about a minute, he took a deep breath and left with the Japanese students without saying a word. The leaving Japanese scholars glared at the Chinese students with fierce and gloomy eyes, as if they had made an agreement. Among them, Maki Fujino and Rina Fukumoto's eyes were the most ruthless. They had never expected that in the end, it would not be the Chinese side that would lose their dignity, but themselves. Facing their gazes, the Chinese students calmly watched them leave. "Come, let's fight. I was not afraid of you decades ago, and I will not be afraid of you decades later." Li Jinyan expressed his gratitude to the arbitration committee. When the American general said that he wanted to take back the magnetic disc, Li Jinyan said, "There is no magnetic disc. I showed them this." He took out a black plastic disc the size of a fingernail from his pocket. "A piece of plastic. If you want, I can give it to you." Chapter 37:28. It was indeed a piece of black plastic. The American general smiled and said, "No need, it's just a piece of plastic." He raised his hand to look at the time and lowered his head. "It's getting late. Since the matter has been properly resolved, we should leave. I wish you good dreams tonight and continue to have better results tomorrow." Li Jinyan did not stay any longer. With a slight smile on his face, he politely shook hands with the three generals and sent them to the car before returning to the Chinese team. The Chinese students who fought for their dignity could finally rest. When they were eating in the wilderness, some students from other countries came over to ask what had happened. The Japanese students who came back earlier were like hedgehogs, standing up their spikes and eavesdropping on whether the Chinese students would say anything bad about them. Tomorrow's competition was a coordinate competition, so they would continue to sleep in the wilderness tonight. The tents of the students from various countries were built next to each other. Because the areas had already been divided, the tents of the Chinese and Japanese students were very close to each other. If there was any movement between the students from both countries, they would be able to detect each other's movements. Now that the foreign soldiers were asking the Chinese students, the Japanese students who were nearby eavesdropped and even deliberately moved a few steps towards the Chinese side. In the end, the Chinese students did not say anything. Instead, they chatted with the foreign soldiers about what they did not do well in today's competition and successfully changed the topic. The Japanese students eavesdropped for a while and found that the foreign soldiers did not say anything bad about them. Only then did they return to their own tent. Matsumoto Michiko coldly glanced at the three students who were eavesdropping on the Chinese students. Her face was very gloomy. "The instructor told us that even if we are standing in front of an enemy we hate, we must be very calm. We must not let ourselves make the first mistake. You should not eavesdrop on what the Chinese students are saying. You should learn from our instructor." He was able to endure when he was at the peak of his anger and walked over to look at the Chinese instructor. What the instructor can do, you should also do. Right now, we are enduring, not having friction with the Chinese side again. The reason why Hirano Ridge suddenly walked over to look at Li Jinyan when he left was to tell the students that if he could endure, the students could also endure. At this moment, the two siblings, Yi Qian and Li Jinyan, were sitting on a small hill not far from the campsite and chatting. Monfei's nights were beautiful. The clear night sky was filled with twinkling stars, and the faint starlight shrouded the wilderness. It was so quiet that just sitting there was a kind of enjoyment. The two siblings started the conversation based on the attitudes of the students from Korea and Japan towards the Chinese student. Li Jinyan talked a lot about how the Chinese students ran into a wall overseas in the 1980s and 1990s. He mentioned that a general had gone to the United States to observe an aircraft carrier. Due to confidentiality, the United States only allowed the general to see a small part of it. Due to the distance, the general wanted to see more and learn more, so he had no choice but to tiptoe to watch. At that time, the Chinese generals had suffered many grievances abroad, but they had swallowed them down. Because China was still in the stage of learning modestly, it was impossible for them to take a strong stance. Now that they had entered the 21st century, China had begun to become stronger, and there was no need to endure some grievances. I am very happy to see your performance today. In you, I see the strength that our soldiers in the 21st century should have. I don't even need to do much to deal with those who disrespect our country. You have already handled it very well. After returning to China, I will write it in the report and let our country know about the growth of your generation of soldiers. Chapter 37:29. In front of Yi Qian, the usually taciturn Li Jinyan always spoke a lot. Moreover, he was very emotional tonight, so he couldn't help but say a few more words. Tomorrow is the last day of the competition. In order to wash away tonight's humiliation, the Japanese will definitely go all out tomorrow. You guys should be prepared. Don't give them a chance to turn the tables. The relationship between the two countries had always been very delicate. It couldn't be said to be very good, but it wasn't very bad either. However, this time, the relationship between the students of the two countries was very tense. Tomorrow was the last day of the competition. The Japanese students who had been holding back their anger would definitely have a final battle with the Chinese students. And in this battle, there was the possibility of personal attacks. The Fujino family and the Fukumoto family are well-known right-wing families in Japan. They have a lot of hatred for our country. Today, they weren't surprised that the two of them broke our flagpole, but they were surprised by our attitude. As long as they know that our attitude is strong, they will understand that even if they do something, they will still have some reservations. Tomorrow was the orienteering event. They had to find the coordinates in the primeval forest within the specified time. Moreover, they had to carry a weight of 27 kilograms. The difficulty and danger of this was very high. First of all, entering the primeval forest was a danger. Then, they had to carry a weight of 27 kilograms. This was a high level of difficulty. Moreover, finding the coordinates was not an easy task. The coordinates could be at the foot of a mountain or at the top of a mountain. It could also be on top of a rock that needed to be climbed. Entering the primeval forest with a weight of 27 kilograms to find the coordinates, and then returning to the finish line to end the 7 days of the competition. Tomorrow was also the day with the highest score. One coordinate was 1 point. Dozens of coordinates were dozens of points. If one reached the finish line early, 1 point would be added every 5 minutes. These points added up to a considerable amount. It was very likely that those who were close to each other would be overtaken. Until today, the Chinese team was still firmly in 4th place. They had 21 points more than the 5th place and 12 points less than the 3rd place. In other words, the Chinese team could pull down the top 3 and catch up. Li Jinyan didn't make any mandatory requirements. However, if they could overtake the top 3, that would be good. Yi Qian was still very confident about tomorrow's competition. His main concern was to guard against the two right-wing students from Japan. The two siblings did not chat for too long, only about 10 minutes or so before returning to the tent. Zhang Minghong and the others were happily chatting with the foreign troops of several countries. The topics they talked about were related to the competition, as well as the customs of their own countries. The foreign armies did not know much about China. Some of them even thought that China did not even have access to electricity. Only the largest cities had access to electricity. In short, in their eyes, China was as poor as it could be. It was so poor that even the Chinese students found it unbelievable. There was no food to eat, no clothes to wear, no electricity. The Chinese students didn't know whether to laugh or cry when they heard this. There is a gap between the rich and the poor in every country, and it is the same in our country. There are some extremely remote mountain villages that do have some of the problems you mentioned, but it is not like what you said. Although our country was indeed very backward for a long time, our country and our people have been working hard to make progress, Zhang Minghong said with a smile. His words showed the confidence of a Chinese soldier. His English was very good, and he could even quote from the classics. He could make a very ordinary thing seem very lively. Even Yi Qian couldn't help but applaud when he heard this. This was an opportunity for students from other countries to get to know China. Every Chinese student would talk about how good their hometown was. When the time came to leave, the foreign troops present would be full of enthusiasm and say that they must come to China after they retire. Like the Chinese soldiers, they could not go abroad for personal reasons during their military service. Chapter 37:30. During the exchange, the foreign students were all amiable and graceful. Although there was a hint of observation, it was understandable because the Chinese students they were interacting with were also observing them. After the foreign students finished their exchange with the Chinese students, they returned to their tents and sighed with emotion. The more they interacted with the Chinese students, the more they realized that their misunderstanding of the Chinese country was too deep. What their country had, the Chinese also had, and what their country did not have, the Chinese still had. 5,000 years of civilization was like a star in the universe that would never fall, gorgeous and mysterious. It made them, who had never been to the Chinese side, have an impulse to immediately set off to take a look. I'm surprised by their security. In our country, a girl, oh no, even a boy wouldn't dare to walk outside at 2 or 3 in the morning, let alone get drunk and lie on the side of the road. That's really, really dangerous. Your property will be in danger, and your life will be in danger. But the Chinese students told us that it's very common for people to walk alone at 2 or 3 in the morning in their country. There might be robberies, but it's really very rare. Yes, I'm also very surprised, but my father once told me that the Chinese side is a very safe country. It's a country where the police only need an electric baton to patrol the street. Before I came into contact with the Chinese soldiers, oh God, I always thought that my father was lying. Now I finally know that my father wasn't lying, but that I knew too little. I think that the reason the Chinese side is able to achieve so much in terms of security is because of their strict control of guns. Their laws prohibit private gun sales. Once caught, they'll be directly arrested and sent to prison without any explanation. I really like this part of them, because my grandmother was shot to death by a 16-year-old boy with a gun. I still remember when my grandmother died. Oh, sorry, brother, I need to go out for a walk alone and calm down. Go, my good brother. It's all in the past, you know? It's all in the past. The students from the United States stopped talking because a student's grandmother was innocently shot to death. They fell into silence and no one spoke for a long time. Students from a country in Eastern Europe also talked about the safety of China. They couldn't imagine that a girl could drive through a village road or a highway in the middle of the night. They also couldn't believe that 1 or 2 in the morning could sit by the river or on the street and eat food grilled with charcoal. That night, the foreign troops who had finished their exchanges with the Chinese side returned to their tents to discuss the safety of the Chinese side. Their words were filled with deep amazement. The Japanese students did not join in, but they could hear what the Chinese students were saying to the students from other countries. They also interacted with the students from other countries, but the wariness they showed made it impossible for the conversation to continue for too long. After a while, the conversation would stop, and after a new round of silence, another round of communication would begin. In the end, the foreign troops who originally wanted to communicate with the Japanese students also went to the Chinese side to have a pleasant chat. The Japanese students who were deeply humiliated tonight were not in the mood to communicate with the foreign troop. Almost every student forced a smile and said a few words, then didn't want to say more. Chapter 37-31. What's more, Maki Fujino, who had been taken away by their instructor, Hirano Ridge, had not returned yet. They were not in the mood to communicate. They were not in high spirits and were in low spirit. The foreign soldiers could naturally feel it. Thinking about how the Japanese and Chinese students had not returned for a long time, they even missed dinner time. Although they did not know what had happened, they could feel that the Japanese students had a deep hostility towards the Chinese students. In the past, they were also very wary of the Chinese students. But now, it had turned into hostility. It seemed that something big had happened for the two countries' students to return so late. What could it be? There were still a few foreign soldiers who thought about it before going to bed. As they thought about it, they also fell asleep. At 5 o'clock the next day, the whistle to wake up sounded on time. The students of each country all jumped up when the whistle sounded. They finished dressing and washing up as quickly as possible. Within 5 minutes, they were all gathered. The orienteering event officially started at 6 o'clock sharp. After breakfast, there was time to discuss how to complete the last event of the competition as soon as possible. Li Jinyan and the Chinese students only had 20 minutes of breakfast time. He was still the same as before. He did not interfere with the competition at all and let the students make their own arrangements. This was a competition as well as a form of training. Since the students were here, they had to make their own decisions. As an instructor, he only needed to give some constructive suggestions. There was no need for him to consider everything for the students, and there was no need for him to worry about everything for the students. The current generation of soldiers had to forge ahead. How could they see the rainbow without going through the rain? During breakfast, Li Jinyan said to the 16 students who had just woken up in high spirits, "You have 6 hours of competition time. It is also the last 6 hours of competition time. Make good use of it and grasp what you want the most in your heart. Also, be careful of the Japanese students who see us as enemies. Maki Fujino and Rina Fukumoto are the key target. Also, Michiko Matsumoto and Yi Chien, pay attention to your side. I won't say much nonsense so as not to give you psychological pressure. Do what you have to do. If something really happens, I will take care of it. You guys can do whatever you want. I will take care of the rear. You guys will take care of the front." There was no need to say anything else. Just this sentence alone was enough. Instantly, the Chinese students were filled with confidence. Although they had 20 minutes of breakfast time, after the assessment team distributed the detailed rules of the assessment, everyone ate their breakfast as quickly as possible and began to discuss the strategy for the last 6 hours of the competition. There are a total of 40 coordinates, and the time limit is 6 hours. It ends at noon, and our search area is in this area. Zhang Minghong spread out the map and slowly drew on it with the pencil in his hand. He then looked at the scale. The 40 coordinates were scattered, and Zhang Minghong pursed his lips slightly. The scope is a little big. If there are any delays in the middle, it will be very difficult to complete within 6 hours. The Chinese student took a look at the search area. It was indeed a little big. After conversion, it was as big as 200 mu. Yi Chien took a look and sighed with a smile. The range is indeed quite large, but think about it. All of the foreign military cadets are searching for the coordinates within this range. This range is not small at all. We have to strike first to gain the upper hand. The further the coordinates are, the more time we waste. That was the main point. Everyone wanted to find the nearest coordinates, so if students from several countries found the same coordinates in the process, it would be a little tricky. Chapter 37-32. As soon as Yi Chien finished speaking, Zhang Minghong, who had a serious expression on his face, said, "There will be such a situation, but the assessment team also considered that the stronger students would be the first to find all the nearby coordinates. Therefore, there is another rule. Each country's student can only have 5 red and green coordinates. The red and green coordinates were the nearby coordinates, and each country could only have 5. Once there were more than that, even if they found the coordinates, they would not be able to have them. This rule was also for the sake of fairness. The stronger students would always be one step ahead of the weaker students. If there was no rule, it would be unfair to the weaker students, because they would not be able to defeat the stronger students. The assessment team wanted to be as fair as possible, so they came up with this rule. Yi Qian smiled and said, "This is a good thing. There will not be too many big fights, but we have to be careful of the Japanese students. I have a feeling that today's competition will not go smoothly. Everyone, be careful. Try not to be alone. The assembly requires everyone to arrive at the same time. Then, the 16 of us will move together and not split into groups. This will be safer. What do you all think?" This was her personal opinion. She still needed to hear everyone's opinion. But basically, as long as Yi Qian raised an opinion, it would not be opposed. It would be unanimously approved. Yi Qian was not the only one who thought so. Many countries' participants had made such an arrangement. They had to reach the finish line together to complete the entire event. Splitting into groups was not a good idea. The Japanese team had been discussing in low voices for a long time. They also decided to move together and not split into groups. The leader, Maki Fujino, said with a gloomy expression, "We need to move before the Chinese team finds the 5 common coordinates. If they find them, they will move in another direction. Unless we are ahead of them and find more coordinates than them, we can only move. So, we only have 2 chances to move against them. The first time is when we find the 5 common coordinates, and the second time is when we overtake them and find more coordinates than them. But I personally think that in the end, we will move before they find the 5 common coordinates." Michiko Matsumoto lowered her head and looked at the primeval forest map they were about to enter. Her carefully groomed eyebrows frowned slightly. Then, she nodded slightly, indicating that she agreed with the leader's arrangement. "Fujino-Koen's arrangement is very good. Let me add one more thing. If we are the first to find 40 coordinates and the Chinese side doesn't have them, then..." While looking at the map, she slowly raised her head, and a cold glint flashed across her beautiful eyes that were even colder than Maki Fujino's. "In that case, we still have enough time to ambush the Chinese students. We're currently ranked 7th, 121 points behind the Chinese team. Even if we get full marks this time, it's impossible for us to surpass the Chinese team. However, the Chinese side is currently in 4th place, and the 5th place is not that far behind them. Once the Chinese side is held back by us, the 5th place will most likely overtake them. Since we don't have a chance to overtake the Chinese team, we'll give number 5 a chance to overtake them. As long as we can pull China down, anyone can surpass us." After Michiko Matsumoto finished speaking, the Japanese students were silent for a moment before they all nodded lightly. They didn't have a chance to overtake the Chinese side, but they could drag the Chinese side to death and give the 5th team a chance to overtake them. Chapter 37-33. With such a plan, the Japanese students made up their minds to keep an eye on the Chinese students after they entered the forest. They were ranked 7th, and the 8th place was 42 points behind them. Therefore, they could only sit firmly in the 7th place with 10 points. But the Chinese students couldn't do that. The 5th place was only 30 points behind them. As long as they took action and suppressed the Chinese students, they could definitely pull them down from 4th place to 5th place. As long as they saw the Chinese students' ranking drop, they would be happy. Last night, they bowed their heads and apologized to the Chinese national flag. At the end of the day, the Chinese student Yi Jian shot down their flagpole and made their sun flag fall down. Thinking of what happened last night, the Japanese students' eyes were burning with anger again. This time, even the instructor, Pinji Ling, supported them. They had to seize the opportunity. At 7:00 sharp, the students of Japan, who were waiting for an opportunity to take revenge, followed the Chinese team closely like a dogskin plaster. When Tianqin said that, Yi Jian thought about the appearance of the dogskin plaster and their sun flag. She couldn't help but smile. But she didn't say it out loud. Although the Japanese students were very disrespectful to the Chinese flag, as a soldier, she would not insult another country's flag casually. This was the basic quality of a soldier. If she insulted the flag casually, then what was the difference between her and Fujinomaki? After entering the forest, they couldn't immediately find the coordinate. According to the prompt, the students from each country had to go 5 kilometers deep to start. And these 5 kilometers happened to be the most dangerous path for the Chinese students. Walk faster, they are following us too closely. It looks like something is wrong. The 3 students walking at the back whispered to the students in front of them through the wireless headset. Yi Qian, who was walking in the middle, stopped and said softly, "Jiang Yang, I will exchange positions with you." Jiang Yang wanted to say, "He can handle it," but Zhang Minghong said, "Yi Qian will cover the rear. She is better than us in dealing with unexpected situations. For example, if someone suddenly played a trick, she could deal with it immediately." When he said this, Jiang Yang understood and quickly exchanged positions with Yi Qian. The students from various countries had already entered the primeval forest. Last night, the students from various countries were still happily interacting with each other like friends. However, when it came to the competition, they all saw the students from other countries as their opponent. Even if they bumped into each other, they would not exchange a single word. In fact, they were even filled with vigilance. When the Chinese and British students met, the students from both countries stared at each other. Finally, the 2 team leaders nodded slightly, and then one went to the left and the other to the right. Seeing this, the Japanese students who were watching from behind had an ugly expression on their faces. They thought that the British students would delay the Chinese students, but they actually had scruples and went around them. Michiko Matsumoto opened the map and looked at it again. With a cold gaze, she walked to Maki Fujino and whispered a few words to him. Not long after, they, who were following closely behind the Chinese students, chose to go in the same direction as the Italian students, bypassing the Chinese students. Their departure did not cause the Chinese side to let down their guard. Instead, they sensed that something was amiss. Yi Qian looked in the direction they had left with a dark look in his eyes. They might be planning an ambush. "Let's reconsider our route." After that, Yi Qian contacted the Chinese students in this way. She was not afraid of an ambush, but she did not want to be delayed to death by the Japanese students. And it was very likely that the Japanese students had this idea. If they really wanted to play an ambush, then let them lie down and wait for an hour or 2. Let them panic. Chapter 37-34. After Yi Qian and Zhang Minghong had a discussion, they spread out the map and rearranged the route. After about 10 minutes of discussion, the Chinese students, who were wearing camouflage combat uniforms and carrying 27 kilograms of luggage, plunged into the depths of the forest. The Chinese students gave up on the 5 closest coordinates and entered the depths of the forest as fast as they could. There was a certain difference between the coordinates of this assessment and the coordinates of the national competition. In the national competition, the coordinates were marked with the number 1, and they had to be searched in order. However, the coordinates of this competition were not in order. You had to find one. Since most of the students were rushing towards the 5 closest red and green coordinates, and the Japanese students were very likely to be up to no good, they might as well go around the closest coordinates and enter the forest. In this way, the marching speed of the army had to be increased. Marching into the depths of the forest did not pose any pressure to Yi Qian. She could not even remember how many times she had marched into the forest. Facing the unfamiliar and complex terrain, Yi Qian led the army to speed up their search for the coordinate. Time passed bit by bit. The Japanese students who were waiting in the middle of the road could not wait any longer. Looking at the time, an hour had already passed, and the Chinese students who should have appeared earlier were still nowhere to be seen. Are they not here yet? Are they lost? It has already been an hour. If they are not lost, they should have appeared in our search area. 54 minutes. We have been waiting for 54 minutes, but they still have not appeared. I also think that they are lost. If they are really lost, then our time has also been delayed. We did not get any coordinates, and we did not find any Chinese students." As soon as this was said, the entire channel fell into silence. That's right, the Chinese students being lost had also delayed their time. Michiko Matsumoto looked at the time. Her expression was not very good. She pressed down on the microphone at the corner of her mouth and said to the leader, Maki Fujino, "Fujino-kun, we cannot wait any longer. An hour has already passed, we cannot wait any longer." Half an hour ago, she had reminded Maki Fujino that they should not continue to wait. However, Maki Fujino did not accept her suggestion. He replied, "We need to be patient." Since then, he had been waiting until now. Now that they had waited for an hour, there was still no sign of the Chinese students. Matsumoto Michiko's attitude was much tougher than it was half an hour ago. "We've wasted too much time, Fujino-kun. If we keep waiting, there won't be any good results for us. We can't wait any longer. It's very likely that the Chinese side has already discovered our plan and has already taken a detour." "How is that possible? Where would they go? Don't they want to get the nearest coordinates? With how cunning the Chinese students are, how could they give up on the nearest coordinates?" Rina Fukumoto was completely on Maki Fujino's side. She insisted that they would be able to wait until the appearance of the Chinese students. Maki Fujino stared at the changing numbers on his watch. When an entire hour had passed and he still did not see any signs of the Chinese team, his eyes turned cold as he said in a deep voice, "It is indeed possible that the Chinese team has discovered our plan. Let's retreat first." Fujino-kun. Rina Fukumoto, who wanted to continue waiting, was unwilling to give up. "We have already waited for so long. Are we going to give up now? If we give up now, wouldn't all our waiting be in vain?" Chapter 37-35. Rina Fukumoto's growl made Michiko Matsumoto's expression turn even gloomier. She crawled out from behind the bushes. Due to the weight of her luggage, she had been pressed down for too long. When she got up, she felt that half of her shoulder had lost feeling. With one hand holding the gun, she rubbed her numb left shoulder against the rough tree trunk to loosen up her meridians. As she moved, she coldly replied to Rina Fukumoto, "If we continue to wait, we'll waste even more time later. While there's still a chance to make up for it, we must retreat immediately and hurry up and find the 40 coordinates." She was glad that the competition's rule was that 1 point would be awarded for finding a coordinate. If the 40 coordinates were not found within 6 hours, the score would be 0. Then, since they had already wasted an hour, they could foresee that their score would be 0. The Chinese side must have noticed their plan, so they absolutely could not wait any longer. Now, it was up to them to see if they had the chance to meet the Chinese students in the depths of the forest. It was not up to the Japanese students to decide whether they could meet each other or not. The Chinese students, who were one step ahead, met the students from the United States, Germany, and Russia, but they did not meet the Japanese students. When they met the students of the 3 countries, they all avoided them in a friendly manner. Both sides did not even have time to greet each other before speeding into the depths of the forest. After 3 hours, the Chinese students had already found 27 coordinate. After 4 hours, they had found 34 coordinate. After 5 hours, they had found 38 coordinate. As time went on, the coordinates became harder and harder to find. Now it was time to return. "We can't go any further. Retreat." The last hour was the time to retreat. Once the time was up, Zhang Minghong immediately stopped moving forward. Yi Qian led the team to return according to the original plan. The Chinese team found 38 coordinates within 5 hours, which was already quite fast. Li Jinyan's mouth slightly tightened. The possibility of continuing to move forward and find all the coordinates was very high, but there was obviously not enough time. Then, what would the Chinese students choose? He hoped that they would return immediately. Just as he was thinking this, the Chinese students turned around from the front. In other words, the Chinese students did not choose to continue moving forward, but to hurry up and return. Although the probability of going back to look for 2 more coordinates was small, it was much more reliable than going forward to look for the coordinate. 5 hours of walking through the primeval forest had already exhausted most of the students' stamina. This was the case for the students from various countries, but there were also a few students who chose to give up halfway. This was because they understood that even if they continued to move forward, they would not be able to find any more coordinate. It was better to reach the destination earlier. The 39th coordinate was found when they were going down the slope. The appearance of this coordinate gave the Chinese students a boost. Now, there was only 1 coordinate left. They discovered that the last set of coordinates was at the bottom of a large rock. Yi Qian and Zhang Minghong spread out the map again and calculated the time it would take to reach the coordinates and the time it would take to reach the endpoint. Not long after, they came to a decision. If they ran down to get the coordinates and increased their marching speed, they would still be able to reach the finish line ahead of time. The Chinese students, who couldn't afford to waste time, received the order from their leader, Zhang Minghong. They didn't have any objections, and all of them did their best to rush to the foot of the mountain. Chapter 37-36. When more and more green tracks were left by the Chinese students on the screen, the instructors from Qin, Ma, and the other Asian countries all pursed their lip. In the last competition, they had once again witnessed the strength of the Chinese students and the fearless spirit of the Chinese soldiers. Although their students' performance was not bad, compared to the Chinese students, they seemed to be lacking something. The Chinese students found 40 coordinates and started sprinting at a very fast speed. Especially at the end of the sprint, which was close to a 45-degree slope, the Chinese students did not relax at all. They took each other's hands and reached the finish line at the speed of a 100-meter sprint. A few instructors who felt that their country's students were lacking something compared to the Chinese students saw the final sprint of the Chinese students and immediately understood what their country's students were lacking. They lacked a tenacious fighting spirit, and the tenacity of the fighting spirit directly determined the strength of the combat power. The Chinese students were indeed very strong, but they were not strong enough to make them afraid. What really made them afraid was their tenacious fighting spirit. Such tenacious fighting spirit was even more frightening than their own strength. This time, the Chinese team won first place in the final competition with an absolute advantage. They were the first to reach the finish line and also the first to find all the coordinate. As for the foreign troops who reached the finish line earlier, even if they reached the finish line earlier than the Chinese team, first place had nothing to do with them. The Chinese students completed all the competitions. As the instructor, Li Jinyan walked towards the students who had won glory for their country amidst the praises of the foreign military instructors. The sun was shining brightly, and the smile at the corner of his mouth was even brighter than the sun. That's right, the rankings and all the glory in this competition were obtained by the students through their own effort. As the instructor, he did not give any advice or accompany them throughout the whole competition. He only stood in front of the screen and quietly watched the competition, waiting for the good news. Now that the good news had arrived as promised, Li Jinyan, who had always been handsome and cold, had a smile that was even brighter than the sun. The students who had handed their heavy luggage to the examiners in turn could finally sit down and rest for a while. When they saw their instructor coming over, Zhang Minghong immediately shouted, "Everyone, stand up!" His voice was hoarse and tired. It could be seen how hard these 6 hours were. Even though it was hard, it was worth it. His body was exhausted, but his heart was filled with excitement. Looking at the young faces in front of him, seeing the stubbornness in their eyes and the growth of this generation of young soldiers, Li Jinyan stood in front of them. He slowly raised his hand and saluted the soldiers who had won glory for the country. On the other hand, the Japanese instructor, Hirano Ryu's expression was as gloomy as a rainy day in winter. It was so gloomy that it could rain at any time. He had actually allowed the Chinese side to reach the finish line ahead of time, and even allowed the Chinese side to find all the coordinates. Last night, he had clearly told them that they must think of a way to prevent China from achieving good results today. In the end, they did not do anything at all. For a whole 6 hours, the students from their country did not meet the students from the Chinese team? How could this be? They had been waiting in the same place for an hour. Could it be that they hadn't run into any Chinese students during this hour? Since they didn't touch each other, why didn't they move for an entire hour? Flatfield Ridge, who did not see the path of the Chinese students, could not think of a solution. Were their own students not moving for an hour to stop the Chinese students? Chapter 37:37. The instructor, Hirano Ridge, couldn't think of a solution. The Japanese students couldn't think of a solution either. They couldn't understand why they had encountered students from several countries during the 6-hour competition, but not the Chinese students. It made them wonder if the Chinese students didn't complete the competition and directly reach the finish line. When they saw the Chinese flag flying in front of them, the Japanese students were so shocked that they almost vomited blood. It wasn't that the Chinese didn't participate, they did, and they reached the finish line ahead of them. Bastard! Bastard! How did they do it? How did they do it? Seeing the red flag flying in front of them, Fukumoto Rina was so shocked that she almost lost her mind. She stopped walking and just stared in front of her, shouting and yelling. Her yelling didn't scare the other students. Yes, Fukumoto was right. How did they do it? All the Japanese students' hearts were in pain, and their mood was even worse. They didn't find all the coordinates, and they didn't stop the Chinese at all. In this round, they lost again. Once again, they lost to the Chinese team. Their hearts were overgrown with weeds. When the Japanese students arrived at the finish line, everyone's face turned green. They were no longer as humble and respectful as they were on the first day, but in fact, they did not hide their arrogance. Compared to the Korean students who withdrew from the competition, they suffered a bigger blow. They suffered a double blow mentally and physically. At 12:00 sharp, the 7-day competition ended. The rankings from the 10th to the top were announced. Every time the ranking of the countries was announced, there would be a loud applause. When the Chinese team's ranking was announced, the applause became even louder. The appearance of the Chinese students made them understand how ridiculous their arrogance was. Especially when they learned that Monfei didn't even send an invitation to the Chinese team, they looked down on the Chinese team even more. Before they even met the Chinese students, they already knew that they must be weak. Otherwise, how could they be ignored by Monfei? The reality shocked them again and again, and made them understand how ridiculous their previous thoughts were. When the Chinese students went up to the stage to receive their medals, the applause was even louder than before. The 3 senior generals who gave the medals shook hands with the Chinese students one by one and said, "Your performance has impressed all of us, and let them see the bravery of the Chinese soldiers. Your country must be proud to have you." This was a heartfelt praise, absolutely from the bottom of his heart. Listening to the tide-like applause and seeing the smiling faces of the Chinese students, the Japanese students standing below the stage all secretly clenched their fists. When the Chinese students walked off the stage, another round of applause broke out. It was really like a high tide, and they were struggling in the tide, almost suffocating. On the stage, Yi Chien inadvertently glanced at the Japanese students and saw Michiko Matsumoto staring at him coldly. His gaze lingered on her for a moment before it slowly moved away. The war correspondent sent the photos and negatives he had taken of the Chinese side over the past few days to the Chinese side, especially the photo of the Chinese soldiers standing in front saluting the national flag, while the Japanese students stood behind with their heads bowed and apologized. This photo became a classic photo. When Yi Qian saw this, her eyes turned into crescents. This photo, she really wanted to make a copy of it and put it in her book. Unfortunately, all the photos had to be handed over. Not a single one could be leaked out. Chapter 37-38. The war reporters had taken many photos of the Chinese students. According to the rules, they were not allowed to directly take photos of the front faces of the students from the other countries. As a result, Yi Qian did not have a single front face photo in the stack of photos in his hands. There wasn't even a clear profile photo. All of them had been blurred out. These photos are very memorable, especially this one. The war reporter from Monfei pointed at the photo Yi Qian was looking at and smiled. This photo is shockingly similar to a period in history. I know about the history of your two countries. When I pressed the shutter, I thought you guys would definitely like this photo. She was a female reporter about 30 years old. She spoke very steadily. Just by listening to her, one could tell that she was a very qualified war reporter. Yi Qian neatly put away all the photos and smiled politely. I really like it. Thank you, Joey. Oh God. You actually know my name. Joey's eyes widened in surprise, revealing an expression of disbelief. She was black, and when her eyes widened, her whole facial expression was very exaggerated. Then, she laughed happily. This is really exciting. I didn't expect you to remember my name. She was very happy. As she spoke, she habitually touched the camera hanging in front of her chest. Because Yi Qian knew her name, even his tone of voice became much more intimate. Oh, I almost forgot. I think you need this. She took out a small brown bottle from her pocket and pointed at Yi Qian's injured fingernail. You should take care of this. You can't just leave it like this. The kindness from the war reporter made Yi Qian's lips curl up slightly. Her fingernail was injured when she crawled under a car to retrieve the flag. After the military doctor took care of it, she did not take it to heart. This injury was nothing to her. Yi Qian took the iodine and thanked her with a smile. He said, "It's already much better. I think it will take at most a week for a new fingernail to grow out." Yi Qian opened the fingernail. Considering today's competition, the military doctor did not remove it. Instead, he used gauze to bandage it. In today's match, Yi Qian felt that the gauze would affect the flexibility of his fingers, so he took it off and let the war reporters see it. Joey said in a serious tone, "Although this is a minor injury that doesn't need to be mentioned, now that the competition is over, you don't have to worry about how the flexibility of your fingers will affect the competition. I think you can go and bandage it again. This will prevent infection and allow the wound to heal faster." Although his finger was no longer bleeding, the entire fingertip was black and blue, which looked quite frightening. Happy that the Chinese student remembered his name, Joey enthusiastically suggested to bring Yi Qian to the military doctor. Yi Qian did not refuse. The competition had already ended, and she had been in a tense state for 7 consecutive days. She also wanted to take the opportunity to take a walk and get some fresh air. The military doctor had his own tent, and Joey had a good relationship with a few military doctors. Before he even entered, he had already greeted them. When Yi Qian approached the tent, he saw that the Japanese student, Maki Fujino, was also there. Beside him was Michiko Matsumoto. When the two of them saw Yi Qian enter, their rigid expressions became colder. Yi Qian was the Chinese student they did not want to see the most. Michiko Matsumoto stepped to the side to block Maki Fujino. She also bowed politely to Yi Qian. She took the initiative to greet him politely. Yi Qian also bowed with a smile. Chapter 37-39. Destroying peace has always been the strength of the Japanese student. Yi Qian smiled and bowed, then walked to another chair and sat down. "Are you here to treat your injured finger? Is it serious?" Yi Jian's polite smile was met with Michiko Matsumoto's concern. Her gaze had already fallen on Yi Jian's injured finger, and her slender eyebrows knitted slightly. It looks very serious. Is it infected? Her expression and tone made it seem like she was really worried about Yi Jian. She was the only one who knew whether she was truly worried or just faking it. Since the other party intended to be polite, how could she ignore it? Naturally, she chose to accept it and treat it politely. Thank you for your concern. It shouldn't be infected. Michiko Matsumoto heaved a sigh of relief. Just as she was about to say something, Maki Fujino, who was stopped, said in a deep voice, Michiko, we can go now. Okay, Fujino-kun. Michiko Matsumoto immediately turned around. While speaking, she did not forget to bow to Yi Jian. Then, she supported Maki Fujino, who was extremely depressed, out of the tent. When she walked out of the tent and passed by Yi Jian, her footsteps suddenly paused. She seemed to inadvertently look at Yi Jian. Her eyes were instantly filled with coldness. Yi Jian, who seemed to have sensed her gaze, generously met her gaze. He saw Michiko Matsumoto's pupils suddenly shrink. Their gazes were like two cars that suddenly crashed into each other on the highway. A short moment of contact was enough to create sparks. This time, Michiko Matsumoto's face did not have the polite smile from before. She nodded again to Yi Jian, who was looking at her, and supported Maki Fujino out of the tent. Chinese student Yi Jian. She is a terrifying existence. Such a person should not appear in the Chinese troops, who are deeply hostile to us. Michiko Matsumoto, who walked out of the tent, did not have a trace of a smile on her face. She was a completely different person from before. A terrifying existence and also a dangerous existence. Fukumoto plans to report to the Fukumoto family after returning to the country, and I will also mention it to the Fujino family. As Michiko said, she is indeed a very dangerous person, especially when she has committed an unforgivable crime. Maki Fujino said slowly and eerily. His entire aura was exceptionally cold. There is only one way to deal with those who have committed unforgivable crimes. What was the solution? He didn't say it, but Michiko Matsumoto understood. After a while, she shook her head and said, from the past few days, it can be seen that China's management of the military academy students is quite strict. The solution you mentioned is very difficult to achieve. Whether or not I can do it, I still need to try. Maki Fujino stared straight ahead. His eyes were filled with murderous intent. She insulted their sun flag. Did she think that she would be safe once she returned to China? Yi Jian, who was accompanied by Joey, was already tending to his wound. Just as the military doctor was reapplying Yi Jian's nails, Joey picked up his camera and took a close-up shot of the scene. Yi Jian was not in the shot, only a slender finger that was being disinfected. Due to time constraints, Joey did not manage to clean up this photo and hand it over to the Chinese side. Later, this photo was approved by the Chinese military and published in Monfei's military newspaper. In the end, this photo was also published in Monfei's largest newspaper. When Xia Jinyuan saw this photo, his gaze was fixed on the small old scar on the hand. His eyes were filled with turbulence. This hand was the hand of the person he missed dearly. Chapter 3740. His little fox actually came to Monfei to participate in the competition and even led the Chinese students to achieve good result. The corners of Xia Jinyuan's mouth curled up with much difficulty, but he quickly suppressed it and pursed his lips tightly. Her fingers were injured, and it was obvious that the injury was serious. After reading the entire English article, Xia Jinyuan's thin lips were pursed so tightly that they resembled thin blades, and his fingernails were flipped open. The 10 fingers were linked to the heart. How painful must it be? Xia Jinyuan, who had not seen Yi Jian for several months, held the newspaper like this. Even though there was no frontal photo, he still stared at the hand that appeared in the photo, as if he could see the person he missed through the photo published in the newspaper. "Xia, my friend, why are you hiding here? I've been looking for you for a long, long time." A rough voice came from behind. Xia Jinyuan calmly retracted his gaze from the photo. His hands did not move, and his eyelids drooped slightly as he continued to read the newspaper. He only looked up from the newspaper when the other person came closer. "Looking for me? Why are you looking for me? If I remember correctly, you should be by Cobra's side today." The person who came was a Caucasian man wearing a white t-shirt and black sweatpants. Although his facial features were deep, his appearance was very ordinary, but he had an oppressive and fierce aura, which made him look very masculine. He sat down and very casually took the newspaper from Xia Jinyuan's hand. After glancing at it, he let out a soft tisk and directly threw the newspaper down from the rooftop. He said very disdainfully, "It's a competition for a group of children. Just a little injury and they wantonly report it. What a group of military school students who are only fit to be raised at home." After that, he leaned his back against the wall of the rooftop. He bent his arms slightly behind his back and leaned against the iron bars on the wall. He said to Xia Jinyuan, "The person Cobra is looking for has been found. Come with us tonight." "Xia, Cobra is thinking more and more highly of you. It's a good thing for you, but it's a very bad thing for some people. You have to be careful." After the Caucasian man finished speaking in a low voice, he suddenly leaned over. His brown eyes were like a snake staring at its prey. He stared at Xia Jinyuan as if he wanted to see through him, but also as if he wanted to verify something. After a while, he said, "Xia, you saved me before, so I believe you. But Cobra doesn't trust you that much, so you have to perform well tonight, understand? It doesn't matter to me whether Cobra believes in me or not, as long as I believe in myself. I'm a little hungry. Do you want to have a drink with me?" "What do you want to drink? Vodka? Or Martell?" At the mention of a drink, the murderous Caucasian man suddenly became excited. He straightened his body that was leaning against the wall, raised his arm, and put it around Xia Jinyuan's shoulder. As they walked, they talked about what kind of drink they should have next. This was Cobra's winery, and there was no shortage of all kinds of wine. If you opened a bottle, you could drink from the afternoon until the sky turned dark. The discarded newspaper was thrown into the trash can. Xia Jinyuan did not pick it up. Here, his every move was being monitored, and he could not do anything out of the ordinary. Night had come, and the lights in the winery went from bright to dark. Several jeeps drove out of the winery and rushed into the vast night. It was time to work. Sitting in the car, Xia Jinyuan looked to the front with an indifferent face, as if he had no interest in what he was going to do next. Chapter 3741. The place they were heading to was a factory. The car was parked several kilometers away from the factory. Xia Jinyuan, who had a gun stuffed in his hand, stood in the dark, quietly listening to a man speak. "Cobra wants us to bring her back tonight. Listen carefully, bring her back tonight. If we don't bring her back tonight, then one of you will be unlucky. Do you hear me?" The one who spoke was a black man. When he said, "One person will be unlucky," he glanced at Xia Jinyuan coldly. Seeing that Xia Jinyuan was indifferent to everything as usual, the black man couldn't help but look at Xia Jinyuan viciously. It was this Asian man who appeared out of nowhere and almost took away his position beside Cobra. If he didn't bring her back tonight, he would definitely make this Asian man suffer. The black man thought to himself viciously and glared at Xia Jinyuan again. Only then did he lead his men to the location of the factory. They didn't make a move immediately. They waited until the second half of the night before taking action. At this time, the armed personnel guarding the entrance of the factory were gradually showing signs of fatigue and became lax. Xia Jinyuan and the white man who spoke during the day avoided the patrol of several armed personnel and quickly slipped into the factory. Then, with lightning speed, they took care of the 2 armed men guarding the entrance of the factory. When the white man saw Xia Jinyuan's nimble actions, he couldn't help but lean over and whisper, "You're very fast. That's why Mike doesn't like you. Luke, aren't you afraid of being overheard?" After Xia Jinyuan finished speaking lightly, he took the lead and flashed into another entrance. He flashed in first. After confirming that there were no problems, the white man, Luke, flashed in and leaned against the wall. In the dim light, he saw Xia Jinyuan in front of him gesturing a number to him. Damn it! 2 people were walking towards them. Just kill them! He made a horizontal cut at the side of his neck. The footsteps in front of him were getting closer and closer. He took a deep breath and quickly approached Xia Jinyuan. The sound of footsteps could be heard. Xia Jinyuan winked at him. The 2 of them went out almost at the same time. They covered the mouths of the 2 gunmen who were about to smoke to refresh themselves and dragged them into the room. They killed them with a crack sound. Damn it, if a few more came, they would be discovered. The Caucasian man, Luke, kicked the man who was no longer breathing. He then picked up the man's gun, removed the magazine, and threw it aside. Damn it, they haven't come in yet. Do they want us to fight to the end? Luke, who had done a series of things, saw that there was still no movement from the people outside. He said to Xia Jinyuan with a gloomy face, "Xia, do you think they will come in?" "I don't know if they will come in or not. I only know that Cobra must see the people inside tonight." Xia Jinyuan glanced at him indifferently, took out a gun and put on a silencer. He flashed to the door and took a look, then quickly retreated. "No one is here. Let's hurry up and go." The white man, Luke, who was 1 step behind, narrowed his eyes. This Xia. He really couldn't see anything wrong with him. Why did Cobra ask him to keep an eye on him? Luke took out his gun and put on a silencer. Whether there was a problem or not was not up to him. It was up to Cobra to decide. Next, it would depend on Xia's performance. Walking out of the room, Luke followed closely behind Xia Jinyuan. The 2 of them, one in front and one behind, walked along the corridor of the factory with low footstep. The people they wanted to bring back were said to be on the 4th floor of the factory. They had to go up to the 4th floor now. Chapter 3742. The factory was a steel processing plant, and there were bundles of cylindrical steel pipes with a black luster everywhere on the ground. The small ones were the size of an adult's thumb, and the big ones were as thick as an adult's arm. After passing through the long corridor of the processing area, there was a turn, and there was an iron staircase leading to the only 6-story building in the entire factory. The white man Luke carefully followed behind. Sometimes he had his back to Xia Jinyuan, and sometimes he was facing Xia Jinyuan, and secretly followed him step by step, and all the movements of the 2 were transmitted to the outside through the button-shaped miniature camera on the white man Luke's collar. The person who was observing the movements of the 2 was none other than Cobra, whom Xia Jinyuan had always wanted to get close to. He was a ruthless character who did not trust anyone and dared to use people. Xia Jinyuan had been here for several months, and had shown his face several times in front of him. He had also made a few small achievements, but he still had not had the chance to get close to him. It could be seen how cautious this person was. A very interesting Eastern man, usually like a lazy man, but every time this kind of thing happens. Cobra's wolf-like eyes stared at the computer screen, and while speaking, he gently shook the red wine crystal goblet in his hand. He took a sip of red wine, and said to the Asian woman with long black hair and fair skin beside him, "How about it, are you interested?" The young Asian woman with long black hair picked up the crystal goblet in her hand, and smiled at Cobra. She raised her glass gracefully and smiled charmingly. "I can help you once, but you have to help me once too. Only then can we continue to cooperate in business. Don't you think so, Mr. Cobra? Deal, and I wish us a happy cooperation." Cobra raised his glass and lightly clinked it with the Asian woman with delicate facial features. I'm very interested in him, and I really don't want him to be attracted by Miss Yoshiko's charm. If he is attracted by my charm, then, Mr. Cobra, I'm sorry. I will be very happy to take him back to our country. Yoshiko winked playfully, and her eyes and teeth were like a young girl in her late 20s. But Cobra knew that the woman from Japan in front of him was so ruthless that she even dared to send her own mother to a mental hospital, just because her mother thought that her brother was more suitable to be the family's heir. Cobra didn't answer her. She just raised her eyebrows slightly and revealed a melancholic smile. How could he let her take away someone he was interested in? No. If there was really a problem with him, he would not let anyone take him away. Since a very powerful fellow could not be used by him, it was better to get rid of him. There would be no worries, and he would not have to worry about whether he would meet him in the future. His smile was reflected in Yoshiko's eyes, and her red and full lips slightly curved. She had no interest in people who were interested in Cobra. No matter how capable she was, it was impossible for her to bring him back to her country. If Cobra was a big poisonous snake, then the people under him were all small poisonous snakes. No matter how small a poisonous snake was, it was still highly venomous. Who would want to keep a poisonous snake by their side? It was a pity that the handsome Oriental man was gone. Although she liked his looks, he was still a poisonous snake. The two of them didn't notice that when the man they were staring at slowly walked towards the iron staircase, his lowered black eyes faintly swept past Luke's collar. Xia Jinyuan glanced at her from the corner of his eye and confirmed that he was suddenly being stared at. Chapter 37:43. Luke did not know that Xia Jinyuan, whom he had been monitoring, had not only sensed that there was something wrong with him, but also knew that he was carrying special equipment. He slowly walked up the stairs and retreated step by step. The pistol with a silencer was always in his hand, ready to shoot as soon as he sensed danger. The people outside finally sneaked into the factory and carefully approached the 6-story building that they had to besiege. The two of them took turns to walk down the iron stairs. In front of them was a tightly locked fire door. Xia Jinyuan first pushed it lightly, then pushed it heavily, then pulled it outwards again. He even shook the handle twice, but the door did not move at all. Cobra, who was staring at the screen, saw this scene and was not angry. Instead, he laughed. Although he was very powerful, sometimes his reaction was not so powerful that he could do anything. If he was so powerful that he could do anything, he would be even more suspicious. An omnipotent young man must have undergone special training. He had completely lost contact with Poseidon, who had not sent back any news. For Poseidon, he had even sent 4 subordinates to China, but there was still no news. There was no news of Poseidon, but there was an Asian man by his side. His appearance was too coincidental, and he could not help but suspect that there was something wrong with this Asian man. However, after observing and investigating for a long time, there were no problems. Except for some fights and a few years of prison life, there were no problems. Hopefully, there was nothing wrong with him. Cobra lowered his head and hid all the emotions in his eyes by drinking. If Funzi could really take away the people around him, then he would have to think carefully about whether there was something wrong with him. Luke's face turned red from holding back his laughter. He patted Xia Jinyuan's shoulder, who was still trying to fight with the fire door. Now you need to move aside. It's my turn. Xia Jinyuan turned to look at him, pursed his thin lips, nodded slightly, and retreated to the side with his gun in hand. In less than a minute, he heard the sound of the door being pushed open behind him. He looked sideways and saw Luke pushing the door open with one hand. He looked vigilant and motioned for Xia Jinyuan to go in first, and he would cover the rear. The person who went in first was usually the one who would encounter the most danger. Xia Jinyuan did not hesitate and quickly went in. Then, Luke stuck close to the fire door and went in. However, the moment he entered, he was dumbfounded. Because he saw 3 men with 3 guns. One of them was aiming at Xia Jinyuan, who had sneaked in first, while the other 2 were aiming at him. When Xia Jinyuan saw him enter, he glanced at Luke from the corner of his eye. The silencer in his hand was hooked to his thumb, and it was obvious that he was ready to disarm. Negative. Why didn't you remind me? When Luke saw that the situation was not right, he immediately raised both of his hands. The pistol was also hooked on his thumb. This was troublesome. There were 2 AKs, and they only had pistols. How could they escape from danger? Xia Jinyuan said calmly, "You didn't give me the time to remind them, and they didn't give me the time to remind you either." The moment he pushed the door open, he was pointed at with a gun. It was obvious that the other party had been waiting for him. The 3 men with guns roared and waved the AKs in their hands. "Put your guns on the ground." When Luke saw this, his eyelids twitched. Negative, they could easily cause the guns in their hands to go off by accident. "Okay, buddy, we'll put our guns down immediately. Don't get agitated, don't get agitated," Luke said repeatedly. He bent down and put the guns on the ground. When he bent down, he took the opportunity to ask Xia Jinyuan, who was also bending down, "Are you confident that you can kill them?" Chapter 37:44. Now was not the time to blame each other, they had to solve the danger in front of them first. Xia Jinyuan slowly put down his gun and answered softly, "I'm a little confident, but we have to let them get close to us first." Being pointed at by a gun in the head was a common occurrence, but he had never been pointed at like this in real life. As for how they found out and waited, they probably saw the locked fire door being pushed open while they were patrolling. When Luke pushed the door open, he didn't do anything to slow down his movements. He pushed it open just like that, and was unlucky enough to be discovered. Right now, they had to get out of this situation first. If they delayed any longer, it would only become more and more disadvantageous for them. "I don't want more people to point their guns at us, let's get rid of them as soon as possible," Xia Jinyuan said in a low voice as he got up, but there was not much fear on his face. Cobra had already seen the situation inside through the button camera. He did not express any displeasure towards Luke's mistake, but instead became more interested. He wanted to see if this Asian man who successfully attracted his attention could successfully break out of the encirclement without alerting anyone else. Breaking out of the encirclement like this should be very difficult. Breaking out of the encirclement was not difficult for Xia Jinyuan. The difficult part was how to not attract the attention of Cobra, who was staring at him like a poisonous snake. Oh right, Cobra translated as Cobra. The person who was staring at him was a poisonous snake, not like a poisonous snake. Xia Jinyuan, who had already vaguely heard footsteps, lowered his eyes slightly. There was not much time left. He began to clench his hands tightly, then slowly loosen them. He tried to let Luke, who was half a step behind him, record his entire body movements so that the poisonous snake on the other side of the camera could see clearly. He was not as calm as he looked. How was it possible for a person with a gun pointed at his head to remain calm? It was impossible. He was only calm on the surface, but inside, he was anxious, afraid, and uneasy. This was to let Cobra see, he had to let him see. Although he did not get close to Cobra after a few months of hiding, he still had some understanding of his habit. He knew that it was best to control a person's weakness and use it to his advantage. He could easily control this person and use him to his advantage. In the beginning, in order to attract the snake's attention, Xia Jinyuan had no choice but to display his strength. Now that he had entered Cobra's eyes, it was time to let the other party know his weakness. This was a psychological tactic, and Xia Jinyuan was one of the best at it. Sure enough, when Cobra saw Xia Jinyuan's little movements, her artist's melancholy eyes narrowed and her interest deepened. As for Yoshiko, who hadn't left yet, when she saw the man secretly revealing uneasiness and fear, her eyes flashed with disappointment. She had always been confident in her charm. She had her own ways to win over a good-looking man like the one inside. The premise was that this was a man who was worth her effort to win over. The moment the man in front of her entered the camera, she was really moved. Perfect figure, perfect facial features, perfect temperament and perfect height. It was as if it was tailor-made for her. She liked it. In the end, such a perfect man was scared of a few AKs. What a pity. Funzi lowered her head and took a sip of red wine, hiding the disappointment in her eyes. What a pity. She thought that if Cobra really didn't want this man, then she could pick him up. But now, if he gave it to her, she had to think about it. Good-looking men always had a flaw. It was too disappointing. Chapter 37:45. Just as Yoshiko lowered her head to take a sip of the wine, her eyes that were looking at the screen suddenly stopped. Then, as if she had discovered a new continent, her eyes burst out with a great light. The red wine in her mouth had not yet entered her throat, but her whole person almost lost her self-control. She suddenly raised her head, staring at the screen with shining eyes. On the screen, the man suddenly made a move with an incomparably handsome movement. His hands were so fast that she didn't even see clearly how he had grabbed the AK that was pointed at his head. Then, he raised his leg and kicked the lower abdomen of the black man holding the AK. The AK that was pointed at his head just now was already in his hands. In an instant, the roles had been switched. Yoshiko didn't see how he made a move. She only saw how he raised his leg and snatched the gun. The two movements were so handsome that she couldn't help but lean forward. Her eyes were filled with interest. Cobra's interest was piqued. He raised his eyebrows and took a sip of the red wine in the crystal goblet. The subordinate beside him took the red wine in his hand respectfully and didn't even ask if he wanted to continue. Luke's reaction was half a beat slower, mainly because he didn't know how to break out of the encirclement. However, his reaction was fast. When he saw what Xia Jinyuan did, he immediately followed suit and snatched the gun from the other party's hand. The other black man with the AK was obviously stunned by the scene in front of him. He was stunned for a moment and gave Xia Jinyuan and Luke the opportunity to snatch the gun. Xia Jinyuan wanted to use his fists to solve the problem, but Luke threw away the AK he snatched and pulled out a pistol with a silencer from his waist. He fired 3 consecutive shots at the 3 people, and the 3 lives disappeared in an instant. Really, I thought I was going to die. I really didn't expect. Luke wiped the sweat off his forehead and gasped for breath. Xia, you saved me again just now. You've saved me twice now. Thank God for letting me have you by my side. After saying that, he even drew a cross on his chest devoutly. Xia Jinyuan took a few deep breaths to adjust his breathing. He picked up the AK that was thrown to the side, turned his head to look at Luke, and shook his head as he walked away. Wait for me, buddy. After praying, Luke saw this and shouted so softly that only he could hear it. He immediately chased after him. The footsteps coming down the stairs were getting closer. Xia Jinyuan leaned against the wall and took a deep breath before saying to Luke, "Later, we'll rush in together. You take care of the people on the left, and I'll take care of the people on the right. How about it?" "No problem, let's see who's faster." Luke raised his eyebrows disapprovingly. Xia Jinyuan shouted in a low voice, "Attack!" Xia Jinyuan and Luke rushed out at the same time. They aimed at their targets and shot at them with their pistols. The 4 patrolmen didn't react in time and didn't even see clearly who was attacking them. They all lost their lives and fell down from the remaining stairs. Xia Jinyuan, who was only willing to praise him, looked downstairs and then downstairs. His thin lips tightened a little. "Are they not coming in? They're already on the 3rd floor. You want to rush in with me to look for them? I think we should wait. It's too risky for the 2 of us to go in together." If something like that happens again, I think I'll faint. Luke refused. He didn't seem to be in a hurry to find them immediately. Seeing Luke's performance, Cobra nodded his head in satisfaction. Luke, one of his bodyguards, was a guy who was very good at disguising himself. He was also one of the bodyguards that he admired very much. Chapter 37-46. Luke was not only Cobra's bodyguard, but also his informant. If anything happened, Luke would report to Cobra in a timely manner. Cobra had always trusted him. After listening to Luke's words, Cobra, who was originally sitting lazily, moved his body slightly, from the left to the right. With one hand on the armrest and the other hand gently rubbing his chin, he waited with interest for the Asian man's answer on the screen. Summer. Not bad, I like summer, the heat emitted can make people burn. Cobra said in a low voice. His melancholy eyes seemed to add a touch of sunshine, sweeping away his decadence. Yoshiko, who was sitting next to him, slightly pursed her red full lip. She was full of interest towards the Asian man on the screen. She had never seen such a handsome and powerful action, instantly subduing her. Handsome and powerful, even if she had to pay for it, she would be willing to. She wanted to take this man for herself. The more difficult it was to get, the more she wanted to get. So, how could she get this man? Obviously, Cobra didn't want to let him go. If he didn't want to let him go, it meant that she had no chance to get this man she was interested in. She had never failed to get people or things she was interested in. This time was no exception. No chance? Then, she would create a chance. Opportunities would never be given to those who waited. Opportunities would only be given to those who were good at creating opportunities. Cobra, who was staring at the screen, didn't notice that the beauty next to him began to hit the Asian man he was interested in. He saw that the man on the screen looked at Luke with some dissatisfaction, as if he wanted to say something, but perhaps felt that it was inappropriate. He tightly pursed his lips, revealing a trace of coldness. Just when Cobra was a little disappointed that he didn't hear what he said, Xia Jinyuan, who was standing next to Luke, softly said, "Cobra ordered us to bring back the person he wants to see tonight. It's already 2:30 in the morning, Luke, there are only 2.5 hours left before dawn, are you sure you still want to wait?" Such an answer sounded very ordinary, but it made Cobra, who was testing him, laugh. Not bad, he kept his orders in mind. When he told Luke, he also told him his concerns. Most importantly, he clearly had concerns, but he didn't make a decision on his own, which made him quite satisfied. He admired powerful people, but he wouldn't admire someone who was powerful and opinionated, and preferred to make his own decisions. He was quite satisfied with Xia Jinyuan's answer. Of course, the shrewd Xia Jinyuan would definitely give an answer that satisfied Cobra, because everything he did was to satisfy him. Luke nodding his head, he looked at Xia Jinyuan with a very serious look. "Xia, you're right, we shouldn't keep waiting for them. Let's go." After that, Cobra, 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 and Cobra, Cobra, and Cobra, 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 and Cobra. The security on the 4th floor was stricter than any other floor. Xia Jinyuan immediately withdrew his body after he leaned forward. He moved his fingers to indicate a number of people. When Luke saw this, he immediately cursed, F***CKU. There were 8 people, and they only had 2. 1 against 4, did they have a chance of winning? He gestured to Xia Jinyuan to see if they should make a move or wait for backup. Cobra. Xia Jinyuan took out his pistol and raised his eyebrows slightly. Luke gave him a thumbs up, indicating that this was a good solution. Chapter 37-47. The two of them had pistols equipped with silencers and loaded the bullet. Without showing themselves, they hid in the corner and started shooting. There was no need to mention Xia Jinyuan's shooting skills. The reason why he attracted Cobra's attention was because of his excellent shooting skills. As one of Cobra's bodyguards, Luke's shooting skills were also quite good. The reason why Xia Jinyuan suggested to shoot directly was because he knew Luke's shooting skills. The pistols equipped with silencers made da-da sounds when they were fired. Usually, the first shot would not attract much attention. Only when the person who was shot fell to the ground would people be alarmed. However, at this time, the second shot had already been blocked by the firing pin. By the time people reacted, another person had been shot and fell to the ground. The two of them with good shooting skills were also very fast. Even if there were 8 people, 1 against 4 would be enough to deal with them. Da-da-da, da-da, da-da, da-da. Continuous gunshots rang out weakly and quickly ended. The two of them did not give the armed guards a chance to shoot and instantly killed 8 people. Seeing this, Cobra nodded slightly several times. He was getting more and more satisfied with this courageous and obedient guy. He raised his hand slightly, and someone immediately approached and bowed respectfully. Cobra only needed to slightly tilt his head to give an order. Yoshiko did not hear what Cobra said. She only saw the bodyguard who was ordered nodded and strode away in less than 10 seconds. He must have gone out to do something. As for what it was not something she knew. Although she wanted to know, it was better to restrain herself a little in Cobra's territory. Yoshiko forced herself to focus on the screen and stared at the man who interested her to reduce her curiosity. Cobra only ordered one of his subordinates to go to the factory to look for people to support Luke. Seeing this, he was already quite satisfied with Xia Jinyuan. Xia Jinyuan soon knew that their backup was clearing the path and that someone was attacking from the other side of the stairs. Following a burst of gunshots, the originally quiet 6-story building was instantly engulfed in gunfire. All the firepower was concentrated on the other side of the stairs. Xia, I finally don't have to worry about whether my life will be left here or not. Go. Luke heard gunshots from the side and knew that Cobra had made a new arrangement. The corner of his mouth that was slightly pressed down had already curled up. It was true that he was worried that he would lose his life here, but now it was also true that he no longer had to worry about his life. It was all because he had reinforcements. Xia Jinyuan could see the subtle changes in Luke's expression. Could it be that the cunning and cautious viper had finally begun to retract its tongue and stop probing him? Could it be assumed that he was one big step closer to Cobra, and would most likely become one of the venomous snake's bodyguards? Luke's lips curled up slightly. Xia Jinyuan, who had been working hard for months to get close to Cobra, also smiled. The two of them did not stay any longer and quickly rushed to the 4th floor. This time, they did not use their pistols. They directly picked up the weapons they had picked up from the 3rd floor and rushed to the 4th floor. The rear was the most difficult to guard against. The two of them opened fire and several people fell into a pool of blood. Luke swept away the timidity he had in front of Xia Jinyuan. At this moment, his face was full of viciousness and his gaze was bloodthirsty. He raised his weapon and opened a bloody path for Xia Jinyuan. To Xia Jinyuan, he did not feel any pressure at all to get rid of these people in front of him. They were all evil people who were accomplices to the evildoers. They were a danger to ordinary people in society. Xia, kick the door. Chapter 37:48. Luke, whose eyes had turned red from all the shooting, roared. Xia Jinyuan immediately ran to the door where he was at and kicked it hard. This kick was so powerful that the entire door cracked open and the lock inside was sent flying. Inside, there was no one holding a gun. There was only a large and sturdy wooden cabinet. From the outside, it was impossible to see what was inside. Luke glanced at it and then looked at Xia Jinyuan. His eyebrows furrowed. A wooden box? Are we looking for a wooden box? It's a very large wooden box. It can fit a few of us. Xia Jinyuan picked up the AK in his hand and carefully approached the wooden cabinet. Luke aimed his gun at the locked side of the wooden cabinet and signaled Xia Jinyuan to pry open the lock with his eyes. Xia Jinyuan walked closer and used the butt of his gun to smash the iron lock. Dong dong dong. With a few forceful blows, the entire lock was smashed off. At the same time, Yoshiko saw that the screen was pitch black. Cobra stood up and said to her in a very gentlemanly manner, "I'm sorry, Miss Yoshiko. I have something to take care of right now. I'll get them to send you back to the hotel to rest. A lady will be more beautiful if she stays awake. Good night, Miss Yoshiko." He had already gotten the people he needed. He could go over and take a look. Yoshiko's eyes flickered slightly. She shrugged her shoulders lightly and indicated that she did not need to trouble Cobra to arrange for someone to send her back to the hotel. She could bring her own people back to the hotel. Cobra did not force her. The two of them happily bid each other farewell and went about their own business. Xia Jinyuan slowly lowered the cabinet door. He did not face the cabinet door directly. Instead, he leaned sideways and used the barrel of his gun to pry it open. With a loud bang, the cabinet door was completely opened. Sounds of struggling could be heard, and Luke pointed his gun inside as he roared, "Raise your hands!" "I'm sorry, Luke. They can't raise their hands." Xia Jinyuan saw the three of them huddled together. Their hands and feet were tied, their eyes were blindfolded, and their mouths were gagged. They were frightened and their bodies were still trembling slightly. When Luke saw this, he chuckled and put away the gun. He then took out a photo from his pocket and looked at it. "That's right. It's the three of them. A biochemical doctor and his assistant. We're looking for them." A biochemical doctor and his assistant? Xia Jinyuan was stunned for a moment. Luke had already taken out his phone to contact the people outside and asked them to drive the car to the factory as soon as possible. "Xia, bring the three of them out. I'll cover you and leave this damned place." It seemed that because of the arrival of the reinforcements, Luke suddenly had more trust in Xia Jinyuan. He gave him the task of charging and breaking through the enemy lines, while leaving the relatively safe task of bringing up the rear to Xia Jinyuan. The three people who were tied up could hear everything outside, but their eyes were tied up and there was no way for them to see clearly. They fell into the terrifying darkness and were roughly pushed out of the cabinet. Struggling sounds came from their throats, as if they were begging for help. Luke replied casually as if he was teasing them, "No, no, no, we're not here to save you. We just happen to need you. You've just fallen into our hands from the hands of another group of people. All right, doctors and assistants, quiet down. Otherwise, I can't guarantee that the bullet won't hit your heart." The three people who were pushed out of the cabinet stiffened. They thought they were saved, but in the end, they were just a bunch of bastards who kidnapped them. Chapter 3749. Other than loosening the ropes on their feet, nothing else was done. Luke also asked Xia Jinyuan to tie the loose ropes on their feet together. This way, the three of them would not be able to escape even if they wanted to. Luke was very cautious. Before leaving, he took out the photo and looked at the faces of the three people again. Only then did he take the lead, and Xia Jinyuan brought up the rear. Together with Dr. Biochemistry and his two assistants, they left the factory. The three of them were like fish on a chopping board waiting to be slaughtered. When the two of them came out, Luke, who was still holding the phone in his hand, contacted the people guarding outside. "Got it. Give Mr. Smith a big gift. Xia and I will bring people out." Dr. Biochemistry and his assistants were completely passive, especially when they heard the dense gunfire. They were so shocked and scared that they did not dare to think about escaping. Even if they wanted to escape, there was no way they could escape with the three of them tied together. So far, they could only follow a group of unknown people. Leaving the factory was much smoother than sneaking into the factory. At least they did not have to be careful. When they saw someone rushing over, they picked up the AK in their hands and fired a burst of gunfire. The gunfire seemed to come from all directions. Xia Jinyuan and Luke cooperated with each other and rushed out with Dr. Biochemistry and his two assistants, who were stumbling as they walked. Smith's backup also came quickly and started a bloody battle outside the factory. Cobra's people were already prepared. If there were too many people, they would throw grenades. If there were too few people, they would shoot directly. Eliminating the backup from all sides made Xia Jinyuan and Luke's evacuation much smoother. They left the factory in less than 10 minutes. Less than a minute after they left, the entire steel processing plant exploded. The huge explosion suddenly came in the wee hours of the morning, startling half of the city. The entire factory turned into a huge fireball. Everything was engulfed in fire. Even the fire trucks could not do anything. They could only watch the fire burn. A big explosion in a steel processing plant in the second largest city in Normandy was reported in the newspapers the next day. Even the domestic military newspaper published the big explosion. It was written that the explosion was caused by the high pressure generated by the boiler. As for what the real situation was, the military newspaper did not give a detailed explanation. It only wrote that it was suspected that the explosion was caused by the high pressure generated by the boiler. The death toll was as high as 37 people, which was quite shocking. When this news spread to China, it also attracted considerable attention. The steel factories even received a safety rectification notice, requiring every steel factory to recheck all the boilers in the factory to avoid similar accidents. Yi Qian had also seen the news, but he did not pay much attention to it. It was only because it was published in the military newspaper that the cadets had to read every day that they took a serious look at it. After reading it, they also treated it as an accidental explosion. What she didn't know was that her boyfriend, Xia Jinyuan, was one of the participants in the explosion. She also didn't know that her boyfriend finally got close to Cobra because of this incident. Another cold winter came. Yi Qian slowly walked through the school wearing a military coat. His military boots squeaked as they stepped on the thick snow. The sky and earth turned white overnight. Everywhere was covered in white snow. It was white and flawless. Last year, when it snowed, she still walked in the snow with him. She listened to him talk about the interesting things that happened when he was studying at the National University of Science and Technology. The two of them occasionally bumped into each other's shoulders, and her heart was as sweet as honey. But today she was all ready. Yi Qian looked up at the field. Roughly calculating the time, she and Captain Xia had been separated for nearly 10 months. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.